In the deserted hall, decorated with huge stained glass windows, Jacob stood alone at one of them, deeply immersed in his thoughts. But the sound of a suddenly opening door and a loud scream attracted his attention. A man in a black cloak ran inside and shouted that it was no longer safe here, and it was clear from his voice that he was terribly frightened of something. When he stopped near him, Jacob calmly asked what was going on. He was trembling all over with fear and asked if he had heard about Street H. Afterwards, he explained that the countless number of undead, which usually only lived in that area, were now heading straight towards them. And they are controlled by none other than the Lord of Blue Evil, or otherwise known as Executioner Clifford. Meanwhile, that same infamous executioner was already literally at the entrance to the Temple of the Dark Order. At his silent command, all the undead under his control instantly rushed at the people belonging to the temple.
Он быстро замахнулся на ничего не подозревающего демона, который не мог его разглядеть в пыли.
The reason for his calm was the best holy knights standing in defense of their temple. Paul, who was fully aware of the entire situation, grabbed his head with his hands and shouted that now they had no one to rely on and wait for salvation. And all because all the holy knights, having turned into walking dead, came under the power of Executioner Clifford and are heading here.
Он пролетел мимо множества каменных островов, по пути превращая их в мелкие камни.
Submitting to him, a whole crowd of undead burst into the temple at once. Only now did Jacob understand what they were trying to warn him about. The dead ran towards them one after the other, each of them wanting to be the first to catch up with their victim. Jacob and Paul, overcome with panic, began to run. But it was already too late. The former holy knights quickly caught up with them and knocked them to the floor. Before Jacob's eyes, these monsters ate Paul alive. Meanwhile, Cliff, gun in hand, slowly approaches Jacob. Stopping next to the man, the executioner stepped on his hand, causing him to cry out in pain. Jacob cast a hateful glance in his direction and hissed that their God would always be on their side and would grant them salvation, no matter how much Cliff tried. The Lord of the Undead pointed a gun at him and said that in this world, only he decides whether to grant salvation to someone or not. Jacob's eyes widened in horror as he saw divine energy begin to seep through his skin. He closed his eyes, already resigned to his death.
Следующий удар он нанес по каменному острову, оставив на месте удара огромную дыру. Подняв голову, он посмотрел на отлетевшую в другую сторону раму и снова замахнулся.
In the eyes of society, the prince was considered a real disgrace to the Holy Empire.
Рама, потеряв сознание, без сил полетел вниз головой. Пак не собирался оставлять его в таком состоянии и снова занес руку для удара.
For this he was severely reprimanded and given punishment.
От этого удара они оба быстро упали на один из островов, тем самым создав огромный взрыв в месте удара.
When all this reached the ears of the Holy Emperor, he lost his temper in earnest. Filled with anger, he exiled the prince to the land of dead spirits. The prince began to protest violently against this order, so the guards had no choice but to take the boy away by force. But even after finding himself in the exiled lands, the prince managed to cause quite a stir by attempting suicide. However, by a lucky chance, he managed to survive. The most amazing thing is that after this incident, the seventh prince became a completely different person. From then on, he began a humble life in a monastery. Many people were literally obsessed and fascinated by M, but were still suspicious of these sudden changes. Some believed that this boy had made a contract with the devil because he saw a dead man walking around the temple grounds and preferred to avoid this temple. Cliff, more than anyone else, knew these rumors well. So after telling them all to his only possible listeners, he asked them what they thought about it. One of the zombies sitting opposite just shook his head and mumbled something inarticulate. The exiled prince stared at the three zombies sitting in front of him for a few moments. Afterwards, he sighed wearily and said with displeasure that because of them new, not very pleasant rumors had started to spread. Clifford was worried that if this continued, he might be wrongly branded as a heretic. In fact, our hero was not even the real Clifford. He used to be an ordinary schoolboy, when suddenly he became the exiled grandson of the Holy Emperor, and ended up in this body when the real prince committed suicide. He soon learned of his ability, necromancy, which allowed him to see status windows appearing above the heads of zombies.
Он взмахнул рукой, мрачно сказав, что шутки кончились.
However, all of his actions were perceived as heresy.
Фрейм встретил стремительно приближающийся палик ответным ударом.
At first, Clifford was really confused when he found himself in an unfamiliar world. But he was able to quickly get used to life here thanks to the zombies, working hard with them. Sometimes they even had their own way of entertaining themselves by doing the job of cemetery keeper.
Но тут позади него внезапно появился желтый демон.
The exiled prince thanked the zombies for their help. They were happy to hear these words from the exiled prince.
пролетев через эту дыру и некоторое время продолжая движение по инерции после удара.
Two of them sank into despair, and the third zombie began to mumble something irritably, waving his fist.
Но Палик даже не обернулся, погрузившись в свои мысли. Он думал, что в этих вечных битвах в конце концов не будет окончательного победителя, пока не появится он.
He also promised to think a little more about the issue of their separation, since they had all managed to become quite close. This arrangement completely satisfied the three zombies. At the same time, two men were pulling a cart with two new corpses.
Пак, не поднимая головы, пробормотал вопрос, зачем он хочет вернуться, если у него уже есть все, что есть в аду. Ответа на его вопрос не было, поэтому и наступила тишина.
They soon arrived at Clifford's and showed him these bodies. When he asked if there were any more corpses left, the men looked at each other uncertainly, then replied that everyone else had run away, and only these two corpses remained. When Edgar, slightly hesitantly, asked Cliff to go to this village, he looked at the man with bewilderment and asked why he would do that. The two explained that almost the entire village had died out, and that they would be much safer being near the prince, since they were only still alive because they often visited him while transporting corpses. He was about to refuse, but Edgar and Smith surrounded him from both sides, tearfully begging for help. All his attempts to object were instantly interrupted by the men.
Он поднял руку, заставив Пака снова вздрогнуть, и продолжил, сказав, что он застрял в этом проклятом месте на 10 тысяч лет.
He nevertheless agreed, and soon they descended into the village located at the foot of the temple. The exiled prince walked ahead, armed with a shovel, and Edgar and Smith walked behind him, trembling with fear.
Его лицо исказилось, и он раздраженно спросил, нет ли там чего-нибудь еще, что он мог бы усвоить.
The hero just sighed heavily and continued on his way, already regretting that he had followed the lead of these blockheads. Suddenly, they all heard a strange rustling sound off to the side, which caught their attention. Completely ignoring the objections of his companions, the prince decided to check what it was. With every step he took, he frowned more and more because the bad feeling only grew stronger. Hearing another rustle, the prince turned around abruptly, but he saw no one except a small rat in front of him. The little rat approached him fearlessly. As soon as Cliff breathed a sigh of relief and calmed down, the rat's appearance instantly changed. In response to her incredibly loud squeak, a whole pack of the same rats with blood-red eyes and unnaturally sharp teeth ran out of a hole made in one of the walls of the house.
Их тихие голоса постепенно становились все громче и громче. Они снова и снова повторяли, что кимчи-чиге – это еда, которую хочет...
He started swinging the shovel from side to side, fighting off the rats. But when they came rushing at him in a new wave, he struck the ground with all his might with the shovel, leaving a deep gouge behind the blow. Only after this did the rats stop. Some of them, from the holy power involuntarily used by the cemetery keeper, fell limply to the ground. Clifford's face showed surprise and great bewilderment at what had happened. Seeing their dead brethren, the zombie rats cast their hateful glances at him. The next moment they rushed at him in a new, more powerful wave.
Однако он не переставал плакать, приказывая Конг-У убить его. По крайней мере, он начал с этого.
The shovel fell into a deep puddle behind the prince. When he shouted at the rats to stop attacking him, the shovel began to shine incredibly brightly. The gray puddle instantly turned into a spring of crystal-clear water. Clifford's face showed surprise as a powerful stream of water washed away all the rats approaching him, after which a message about using the Death Swamp skill appeared in front of him. Edgar and Smith came running worriedly to the noise. Now all three pairs of puzzled eyes were directed at the purified holy water and the rats lying nearby. Clifford was the first to come to his senses and reached for his shovel. He was glad to know that he could use other skills besides necromancy. And since this body belonged to the grandson of a holy emperor, it meant that he could use his necromancy skills to purify, making him a holy necromancer. The prince was pulled out of this stream of thoughts by another rustling sound that came nearby. A fair-haired girl came out from the house opposite to them. The men immediately recognized her as Angelica and waved their hands joyfully.
Он отвернулся от нее и закрыл лицо руками, умоляя ее исчезнуть.
The next moment, she instantly rushed past the men attacking them. Her ultimate goal was Clifford.
Подняв руку, сжатую в кулак, он призвал всех в комнате замолчать.
Falling to the ground, he swung the tip of the shovel in front of her face. After examining the girl in front of him and assessing the way she was holding the knife, the prince came to the conclusion that Angelica had not yet completely become a zombie. Suddenly, tears started flowing from her eyes and she began to say something quietly. Cliff tried to listen to her speech and understand what she wanted to say.
Он встал со своего трона, думая, что теперь пришло время.
With no other choice, he once again resorted to using holy power, which burns through the bodies of zombies. When the girl's pressure weakened a little, the prince was able to knock her into a puddle of holy water. Once inside, Angelica began to scream in pain and try to get out.
А затем с ужасающей аурой он мрачно спросил, действительно ли ему нужно
However, the girl did not hear him at all and continued her attempts. After a couple of endless minutes, the prince was able to breathe a sigh of relief.
Коленопреклоненные демоны немедленно подчинились его приказу.
A couple of days after this incident, the villagers, led by the village elder, visited his temple. They had already heard that the exiled prince had cleared out the rats that had infested the village and even helped Angelica. The elder asked the prince to provide similar help to them as well. He slammed the book he had been reading earlier and replied that he hadn't saved anyone. That girl had died. This confession greatly surprised the villagers and left them perplexed. Cliff noticed their reaction and asked with surprise in his voice how they thought he was supposed to save people since he had absolutely no abilities despite being related to the Holy Emperor. What he said plunged everyone into true despair because they had come a long way in order to get help for their village, and now it was all in vain. The prince, who was watching them, sighed and asked where they had ever heard about him saving people. But before the village elder could answer, an excited smith burst into the hall. Afterwards, he happily reported that Angelica, whom they had saved earlier, had finally woken up. Just after saying this, the man turned his attention to the large crowd gathered there. The villagers turned their irritated and angry glances towards the exiled prince, with the question hanging in the air as to what all this meant. Clifford swore quietly through gritted teeth. Everything would have gone according to his plan if not for Smith, who intervened at the last moment.
Манмаджонг – слово, описывающее часть внутри Кан-У, содержащую сгусток великой силы.
However, the prince put forward several conditions before agreeing to their request. Taking another good look at the village elder, he saw a window hanging above him that displayed information about the man, and it was also noted that he was incredibly skilled in various tricks and was currently full of doubts about our hero. After reading this, Clifford sighed in disappointment, thinking that they wanted his help, but didn't trust him because he was a worthless exiled prince. Afterwards, he voiced his condition. He was not going to work for nothing, so he asked for money and food in exchange for help. He also looked around and added that they should restore this cathedral for free. When the headman asked if this was too much, Cliff turned around and said that their lives depended on it. But if they did not want to, he did not intend to force them. But the residents could not miss this opportunity for salvation and agreed. But when the prince turned around and said he had one more condition, everyone was stunned, wondering what else he wanted. Contrary to their expectations, Clifford only asked the village chief to make sure that the Holy Knights did not find out about this deal. Otherwise, there would be problems. Once all the necessary formalities were settled, a joyful smile appeared on his face at the thought that at last the cathedral, destined for exile, would shine with new colors after the renovation.
Мгновенно в пространстве образовался раскол, и перед его взором возник черный проход, в который он тут же направился, сказав, что уходит.
Returning back to the bench where he had been sitting a few minutes ago for his shovel, he shouted for everyone to grab their pitchforks. When the crowd began to shout in confusion, Clifford smiled evilly and said that he was not going to fight alone. So while he was reading the holy prayer, they could do some hard work. His words made the villagers regret the choice he had made and further strengthened their belief in the rumors of his connection with demons. However, no one had time to object, because literally the next moment one of the men literally stuck to the window and shouted with horror in his voice that the zombies had already come for their souls. Clifford also did not expect the undead to appear here so quickly, but he tried to remain calm and he succeeded until the moment he personally saw the number of approaching enemies. There were not just 30 zombies moving towards them, but many times more, a countless army of undead.
И когда она это сказала, одно из щупалец, расположенных рядом с сердцем, действительно лопнуло, и из него хлынул гной прямо под пристальным взглядом обернувшегося не вовремя Конг.
A few moments later, a fierce battle broke out on the temple grounds. Clifford and the villagers tried their best to fight off the zombie attack. With the help of holy power, he was able to quickly deal with several opponents at once. Our hero was already a necromancer before, so it wasn't that difficult for him to use his current skills. In order to earn some extra money, he tried himself as a beta tester in the past. His task was to play as a necromancer. But during the testing, one unfortunate incident occurred and Clifford died from an electric shock and ended up in this world. Despite this, he was glad that his abilities from the game had migrated here with him.
И с радостной улыбкой он сказал, что теперь он наконец-то вернется на Землю, Но вдруг его привлекли странные звуки, которые начало издавать ядро, который изначально сообщил об ошибке доступа к ядру.
The man, with tears in his eyes, screamed that he couldn't do it, even though he knew there was a zombie in front of him. The reason for his condition was that his wife was in the crowd of undead. That's why he couldn't overcome himself and kill his own wife, even though she had become a zombie. However, she had long since lost the rest of her mind and attacked Greg without a drop of doubt. Clifford managed to do it just at the last moment, knocking the zombie woman off her feet with a blow to the head. She fell to the ground, flying back a little. The prince, addressing Greg, said that she was no longer human, so if he did not want to die, he should accept this reality as quickly as possible. When the man began to object, Clifford pointed towards the zombie that had attacked them and said that her body was rotting and her soul had long since left this world. Greg stared at his wife unblinkingly, forcing himself to believe the words of the exiled prince. As the zombies rushed at them again, Clifford looked back at the man behind him and shouted that he either stop crying and fight or run away from here and continue to feel sorry for himself. Immediately after these words, the prince stepped aside, dodging the zombie's attack. But the next moment he freezes in place, his eyes wide with surprise. He saw a vaguely familiar figure flying out of the sky straight towards them.
Как только он подумал о проверке своего тела, перед его глазами появилась синяя панель. Удивленный, он повернулся к окну статуса.
Afterwards, she slowly rose from her knees. With a calm expression on her face, Angelica looked at Clifford and asked if he was okay. Autumn and winter brought not only cold, but were also a time when a mysterious disease spread with incredible speed, capturing everything around. Angelica believed her mother's words that everything was already over and this year, everything would finally be okay. But soon this fragile hope was destroyed. The girl ran into the house, abruptly throwing open the heavy wooden door, and, in a real panic, loudly shouted that there were countless strange rats with red eyes on the streets. However, the next moment her eyes widened in horror, and she froze at the door. A chilling picture appeared before her. Broken dishes, many bloodstains on the floor, and, most horrifying of all, a woman lying on the floor who had been Angelica's mother, over whom a monster with blood-red eyes loomed. Bleeding, Olivia, with tears in her eyes, whispered to her daughter to run away from there as quickly as possible.
Мгновение спустя монстры, сраженные черным кинжалом Конгво, упали на землю.
Trembling with horror all over, she watched with unblinking eyes as the monster, who had been her father that morning, bit into Olivia's body. A few long moments later, both of Angelica's parents had become monsters. And now the girl was being pursued not only by the maddened mice, but also by her own parents who intended to kill her. In a desperate attempt to defend herself, she grabbed onto any object that could become a weapon. And at some point she had to take a desperate step to kill her parents. An exhausted Angelica, looking more like a lifeless doll, sat motionless by the window, covered from head to toe in the blood of monsters. Her empty eyes slowly but surely changed their shade from dark to red, but the girl herself did not notice this. Instead, she noticed other oddities. All the people in the village began to behave very strangely, and the rats that were trying to eat her at some point stopped paying attention to her. But all this no longer bothered her, because she had long since stopped hoping for salvation. However, unnoticed by her, in her soul there still burned a desire for someone to come and save her. And one day her prayers were heard. A man appeared who was able to put an end to her suffering. Waking up from a long sleep, Angelica suddenly opened her scarlet eyes. Her breathing was heavy after all the pictures of the past she had seen. The girl had absolutely no idea what these memories were and why they evoked such emotions in her. Noticing her awakening, a worried woman approached her and asked about her condition. Angelica sat on the bed, holding her head, and ignoring the question, asked where she was. When she replied that the prince had asked her to take care of her, the girl became confused, not understanding at all which prince she was talking about. Suddenly, her attention was drawn to the loud cry of a guy with a shovel that sounded under the window, saying that it was time to stop whining and start fighting. Angelica looked at him in surprise, vaguely recognizing the voice of her savior. Giving into impulse, she abruptly got out of bed and opened the window, letting the cold autumn wind into the room. Ignoring the woman's bewildered cries, she fearlessly climbed onto the window frame. And the next moment, she jumped down. Falling to the ground like a whirlwind, she scattered all the monsters surrounding the prince. Afterwards, she looked back, checking whether the person who had saved her, whom she had decided to follow and protect, was hurt.
Там среди толпы монстров стояла девушка. Парень начал ее осматривать. 2 глаза, 1 нос, 1 рот – это человек.
Then he turned his gaze to the jubilant crowd of villagers, who joyfully threw Angelica into the air and shouted their gratitude. The prince breathed a sigh of relief. realizing that the purification before becoming a zombie had not affected her in any way. After standing for a while, he approached the crowd and told them to deal with the remains of their relatives. His words caused a storm of bewilderment and discontent among the crowd. Clifford could not help but notice this. So he said that it was worth doing despite the fact that everyone was tired after the battle, because their relatives had suffered all this time. And now, finally freed from pain, they deserved to rest in peace. This convinced the villagers, and they all nodded their heads in silence, agreeing with the prince. But the atmosphere, as well as the mood of the crowd, remained heavy, so the hero decided to help them with the ritual.
Лишив жизни гоблинов, юноша побежал к удивленной девушке, сидевшей на земле.
There was nothing complicated about it. You just had to bury the dead and wish them peace, so that the spirits would not wander around and would rest. It was for this very task that he was originally banished here. Watching the souls leaving this place, the prince thought that in such lands the chance of zombies appearing was very high in itself, and in any case, someone would still have to deal with the dead. But something still seemed rather strange to Clifford. He had never heard of so many villages being destroyed at one time before. He also knew very well that it was still too early for the death wave. Hearing his name, the elder turned around. The exiled prince approached Philip and asked if anything strange had happened in the village, but the man shook his head and replied that everything had been calm when an unknown disease suddenly began to spread about a month ago. After listening to him, Clifford suggested that this could all have been planned. As soon as he mentioned the Necromancer, Philip and everyone nearby froze in place with an expression of wild horror on their faces. When frightened and indignant cries mixed with curses rained down from different sides, he regretted the words he had spoken. At one point, he even had to cover his ears because the screams became too loud. He already had a theory that among those present in the temple now, there was someone who controlled the zombies. The only problem was how exactly he could figure out this person.
Парень тут же поймал ее и спросил, все ли с ней в порядке. В этот момент из ее кармана выпал прямоугольный предмет. Глаза парня расширились от удивления, когда он понял, что это за прямоугольник.
After taking a couple of steps, Cliff, without even undressing, immediately fell exhausted onto the bed. As soon as his head hit the soft pillow, his eyes slowly closed and he fell into a deep sleep. In the morning, he was suddenly awakened by loud screams coming from outside the temple, causing him to jump up in bed. Yawning, Clifford went to the window to see what had already happened there. The news that zombies had stolen a man stunned the exiled prince, forcing him to push away the remnants of sleep and return to harsh reality. Having dressed hastily, he went downstairs and asked Matt and Lucas to tell him more about what happened, asking before that if they were sure that zombies were the kidnappers, to which Matt confidently replied that he had seen it with his own eyes. Later, he said that he and Lucas were walking near the temple early in the morning and suddenly heard someone's loud cry for help. Afterwards, they saw a zombie carrying Marie away. When Clifford asked which Marie he was talking about, Matt explained that she was a young girl who usually collected herbs and that she used to help the villagers. Feeling something strange in the guy's intonation, the prince asked if he knew this girl. The friends looked at each other uncertainly, and then Matt said that Marie was quite beautiful and had once refused the prince.
Думая, что его уровень еще ниже, парень запоздало ответил, что у него были свои причины там находиться.
He interrupted Matt, saying that he had already remembered everything, so there was no point in continuing. He awkwardly cleared his throat and said that they needed to form a search party and go look for this girl. Cliff had no idea what these two were thinking when they made such a dangerous and completely ill-considered proposal. But in some ways, he agreed with them. He needed to check everything and find out what the hell was going on here. In his memory, this was the first time a zombie had kidnapped a person and dragged him away instead of devouring his victim on the spot. And this greatly alarmed the prince, so he could not remain on the sidelines. As he pulled on his jacket, he said that they first needed to find where the zombie was hiding, to which Matt replied that a hunter from their village could help with that. Clifford's words that they would set out immediately made the boys very happy. The prince wanted to add something else when he noticed someone staring at him. Turning around, he saw Angelica standing next to him, who had been staring at him the whole time. Clifford looked at the girl expectantly for a few moments, thinking that she wanted to tell him something.
Они остановились и с восхищением посмотрели вверх. Хан Сол сказал, что они прибыли.
Deciding not to linger there any longer, he called out to Matt and Lucas, telling them to hurry before Marie became a zombie's meal, and the three quickly left the temple grounds. Left alone, Angelica looked sadly after them. Some time later, our heroes found themselves at the entrance to the cave in which the zombie had previously hidden along with its victim. When they discovered the cave, Clifford thanked Duke, who was a hunter, for helping them find it. Afterwards, he walked forward a little, carefully examining the cave, which was completely saturated with ominous demonic energy. Taking this detail into account, he became even more convinced of his assumption that there was someone behind the zombies. When he asked if they should burn the place to the ground, Matt shouted out in disbelief that Marie was still inside. Clifford explained that in such places, overflowing with demonic energy, the undead become much stronger, and if everyone ran inside just for the sake of one woman, they would die there. After his words, Matt's determination to rush into the cave diminished greatly, and he asked how they could then save Marie. Clifford replied that they should prepare better and return, although this would lower the percentage of the probability that the girl was still alive. But this way, they would have a better chance of returning alive. Hearing a strange rustling sound behind him, he broke off mid-sentence and turned around. The next moment, he found himself looking into the scarlet eyes of a bear, whose wide-open mouth was dangerously close to him. The bear's teeth clamped down hard on the prince's forearm, causing him to cry out loudly from the sharp pain that pierced his arm.
Хана продолжала смотреть на него с удивлением, как вдруг ее нога снова дала о себе знать.
As the bear dragged him into the cave, Clifford's companions rushed after him. Approaching the cliff, the bear threw the prince down.
Отвернувшись, она смущенно продолжила объяснять, сказав, что хотела бы поблагодарить его и, возможно,
As soon as the holy water touched the bear's paws, he rose up on his hind legs and growled in pain. Clifford, collapsing onto the hard surface, grabbed his bleeding shoulder and also used the skill. A few moments later, the wound healed, leaving not even a hint of a scar. After finishing the treatment, the hero decided that he should be more careful because his divine powers were already almost at zero. Just as he was thinking this, he heard loud footsteps approaching behind him. The bear looked at Clifford with even more fury in his gaze than before. In the message hanging above his head, the hero read that the condition of this monster was aggravated by necromancy. This message explained to him why this bear was still standing on its paws after the holy water. And the prince also understood that the situation was taking a much more dangerous turn since this zombie bear was under control. He had no idea how he could defeat this bear with his bare hands.
Он сообщил, что личность была подтверждена. Проверка длилась буквально секунду.
Clifford barely managed to dodge the sharp teeth of the beast, which slipped a few centimeters from him. The bear didn't stop there. Quickly turning around, he swung his clawed paw at the guy. When he was almost ready to say goodbye to life, Angelica appeared out of nowhere and plunged a sharp knife into the monster's eye, causing him to howl again in wild pain. The girl leaned back a little, trying to stay on the beast's huge body but still keeping her wary gaze on the bear's face. Suddenly, he jumped up on his hind legs and howled even louder. Clifford watched the scene unfolding before him in bewilderment, greatly surprised that Angelica had been following them the whole time.
Его глаза снова заблестели, тем более, что среди множества регионов Земли именно там находится Сеул. И теперь его ждет счастливое будущее.
However, the next moment, Angelica was thrown down by the bear. She rolled to the side in time, a second before the bear's powerful paw came crashing down next to her. Although Angelica dodged the paw, now she found herself faced with a wide-open mouth. Reacting quickly, she plunged the knife into the bear's mouth. But despite the pain, he slowly tried to close his mouth. Suddenly, a strong blow knocked him off his feet. The bear flew off with a crash against one of the walls of the cave. Angelica looked at him with wide eyes in surprise, not understanding what had happened. Hearing Clifford's voice thanking her for taking her time, the girl turned around and, holding out her hand, said that it was she who should thank him. Before, she thought it was the prince who extended his hand to help her up, but instead, she saw the hand of a zombie. This completely confused the girl. Meanwhile, other zombies began to rise from the ground near her, one after another. Angelica, sitting on her knees, watched this with shock in her eyes, completely not understanding what was happening here. Clifford had a satisfied grin on his face. All the zombies here followed his will, which greatly increased the chances of defeating the bear. A few moments later, several zombies simultaneously pounced on the monster, gnawing at its flesh. He reared up on his hind legs and roared furiously in pain. At some point, the bear swung its paw and slashed at the zombie. Two of them flew to the side, hitting the cave wall with a crash. Immediately, zombie hands appeared from under the ground again and reached out to him.
И было ли полезным резкое увеличение числа игроков по всей планете? Можно ли их считать надеждой человечества?
Clifford was very lucky that this bear managed to kill quite a few people, thanks to which he was able to summon so many zombies, but such a number of subordinates very quickly depleted the prince's strength. But the bear did not give up so easily. He roared furiously and tore apart the bodies of the zombies that had surrounded him with his claws. Having cleared all obstacles from its path, the roaring monster approached its original target, Clifford. However, He didn't have time to do anything because at that moment a knife flew at his head. The prince was shocked when the monster looming over him fell to the ground, exhausted. He turned his puzzled gaze to Angelica, once again amazed by the strength of this girl. She meanwhile began to pull her weapon out of the monster's body. But when Clifford suddenly felt weak and swayed, holding his head, she turned around and asked with concern if everything was all right. Without waiting for his answer, she rose to her feet and took the prince by the arm. He explained that he was fine, he had just used too much strength at once. Afterwards, he glanced sideways at the bear and the zombie bodies, thinking that if it weren't for Angelica, he would already be dead. When Clifford quietly said her name, the girl looked at the guy's face with excitement. Without looking up at her, he said that today he had shown her all his power and asked her to keep everything a secret, because he wanted to continue living a calm and quiet life. The girl was very surprised by his request. Our hero was not lying when he said this. He really wanted everyone to just leave him alone after resolving this problem and never bother him again. When Angelica said in a serious tone that Clifford was her savior and therefore she would fulfill any of his wishes, the prince looked at her in bewilderment and asked when he managed to become a savior. However, he did not have time to hear the answer because at that moment someone called out to them from above. Matt, with a rope over his shoulder, asked worriedly if everything was okay with him and Charlotte, then added that he and the guys had grabbed equipment to explore the cave. Clifford wanted to say that everything was fine and they didn't need to go down here, but the three guys were faster. Tying the rope near the stone, Matt began to carefully climb down. Having found himself on the ground quite quickly, the guy looked around in surprise and asked who had dealt with the bear and all those zombies. From rumors, he knew that this monster was widely known as the King of Gluttony, and no one knew how many people had already fallen at its paws. Before Angelique could say anything that could jeopardize the prince's secrets, Clifford said that there was a necromancer somewhere in the cave. Seeing the confusion in both of their eyes, he explained that the necromancer had tried to turn this cave into his refuge and killed the bear, and when Angelica arrived, it was already dead.
Однако это произошло из-за того, что в нем еще сохранилось что-то от человека, его аппетита и вкуса.
Clifford, however, was thinking that too much time had already passed and Marie could already be dead. He understood that the necromancer was trying to lure them into a trap in order to kill as many people as possible with the help of the bear. When Matt approached them to ask what they should do now, the prince sighed and replied that they should move on. When asked if he was confident in this decision, the prince only briefly replied that he was confident. Clifford was determined to find out who this necromancer was and how good he was. Thus, they all continued on their way together, going deeper and deeper into the cave until they finally reached the necromancer's refuge. After carefully examining the small room in front of him, Matt noticed something and told Clifford about it. But the prince himself had already noticed a tied-up girl sitting by the far wall, in whom the kidnapped Marie was easily recognized. The three worried boys left their hiding place and ran up to her. Clifford and Angelica were in no hurry to approach the hostage so quickly. Our hero was truly confused and did not understand why Marie was still alive. However, his stormy stream of thoughts was quickly interrupted when a blue window of the system appeared in front of him with information that shocked him.
А затем, смущенно опустив глаза, сказала, что это она должна его благодарить.
Looking around at everyone present, she smiled happily with tears in her eyes and asked if they had all come here to save her. Instead of answering, Clifford quickly approached her and without a drop of mercy hit the girl on the head with a shovel. Thick blood gushed from her mouth as Mary, not expecting such a sudden and powerful blow, fell to the ground. All the prince's companions watched what happened with shock in their eyes. When Smith, the first to recover from the shock, asked Cliff in bewilderment why he had done it, Cliff replied in an unusually cold and merciless tone that he should have hit him with the sharp part of the shovel. Frightened for Marie's life, Smith immediately ran up to her, and the confused Matt tried to find out from the prince the reason for his cruel act.
Из облака образовавшейся пыли вынырнул силуэт и грубо спросил, что за черт? Когда Хан Соул и ее мать приблизились, испугавшись, он объяснил свое поведение тем, что что-то заклинило дверь.
Continuing to play her role as an innocent girl, she said in a voice trembling with fear that he had misunderstood everything. But Clifford wasn't going to play along with her and said dryly that she wouldn't be able to fool anyone again. When Matt and Smith heard that Marie was the necromancer, they froze in place from shock.
Он скривил лицо в ухмылке и встал перед Хан Соль, грубо заявив, что, мол, она вошла в ворота одна, без...
But Mari quickly pulled herself together and desperately shouted that this was not true and that the necromancer had dragged her here by force and tortured her. To this objection of hers, Cliff only smirked, showing that he did not believe her for a second. After thinking for a moment, he said that she could prove her innocence quite easily.
На лице Тэйхуна появилась жуткая ухмылка. Он спросил, что она хочет сказать.
Seeing the doubt on her face, he said that if she really was a necromancer, then all her organs would melt. But if he was wrong, then she had absolutely nothing to fear. All her wounds would instantly heal, without even leaving a scar. Clifford watched the girl's reaction closely and couldn't help but notice how her face turned gray. And she looked away and replied that he was unworthy of receiving something so valuable. The hero was determined to go all the way, so he approached her with a terrifying smile on his face, saying that this water was indeed very valuable, but he was willing to gladly give it to clear up the misunderstanding that had happened here. Marie's face showed genuine animal horror before him. She had absolutely no idea how Clifford had managed to expose her, because her disguise was perfect, and for a long time no one had even the slightest suspicion while she played the role of the sweet and caring Marie in the village. Besides, he was very frightened by the guesses about the power he possessed. She understood perfectly well that an ordinary person of the lowest level would not be able to deal with her bear. Having not heard her answer, Cliff, with undisguised displeasure in his voice, asked again whether she was going to drink the holy water or not. He was truly perplexed, because the prince was giving her such a valuable thing right into her hands, and she didn't lift a finger. At this moment, Marie, whose appearance began to rapidly change, looked up at Clifford and said that she had originally intended to get rid of him during the death wave. The prince's face reflected surprise. He didn't even have time to react when the bottle of holy water was knocked out of his hand in an instant and, hitting a hard surface, broke. Immediately after this, several bony zombie hands appeared from underground. Marie, who had finally turned into an old woman, shouted loudly that she had tried to show mercy and prolong Clifford's life, but today, with his actions, he had hastened his death. Being fully confident in her abilities, she gave the order to the zombie and laughed contentedly. Using only a shovel, our hero, without much effort, got rid of one zombie after another with just one blow. Without looking up from beating up the undead, Clifford shouted at the confused Marie that she shouldn't address him with such arrogance. At that very moment, a dark shadow flashed behind the unsuspecting old woman. Angelica pinned her to the ground, pressing her knee hard into her back, stroking one of Marie's subordinates, a zombie, on the head. The prince thanked the girl for her excellent work. Marie's voice was full of fear and confusion when she asked who he was and what her zombie had done. But the hero ignored her questions and with a smile on his face, slowly approaching her, said contentedly that some truly amazing shovels were happening right now. These words led Marie to the assumption that the shovel in his hand was a sacred relic, which explained all the oddities. The prince did not intend to dissuade her of anything and simply said that instead she should think about herself.
С гнетущей аурой он мрачно сказал: «Ладно, раз они оба игроки, то должны хотя бы раз сделать все правильно».
After several minutes of beating, Marie voluntarily revealed that she was indeed a necromancer and her real name was Morgana. Upon hearing her confession to Smith, Matt and Duke were greatly shocked and would have found it hard to believe if they had not seen it with their own eyes. When Morgana began to beg for her life, Clifford, already having some suspicions, asked if this was someone's order. The woman frowned in displeasure and reluctantly said that she had indeed been ordered to lure him here and disguise his death as a suicide. The prince was surprised when he heard this, but it also made him think that the previous owner of this body was not as pathetic as he had previously thought, and he was now sure that that death had been staged in the same way. He was pulled out of his stream of thoughts by Morgana's words that the Dark Church had ordered the killing of the seventh grandson of the Holy Emperor. When she said that the church wouldn't let it go so easily if they knew that Clifford was a necromancer, the prince slowly approached her and coldly said that she had seen too much, so he had no other choice. Hearing her name, Angelica understood the unspoken order given to her and brought the sharp knife closer to the woman, whose gaze was frozen in horror. She turned her gaze, full of fear for her life, to our hero and shouted that she would not tell a single living soul about this and in exchange would tell him more about the Dark Church.
Взяв ее за лицо, он продолжал насмешливо спрашивать, что она может сделать, ведь у нее нет ничего, кроме красивого лица.
Approaching the woman trembling in pain, he summed up that her future fate would be determined by the villagers, because there were many people here who had lost members of their families because of her. At that moment, 3 ominous figures loomed over her. Morgana began to crawl back and beg for mercy.
Постепенно, снова раздражаясь, он посмотрел на парня, который не обращал на него внимания, и спросил.
He followed his comrades with his eyes, who were already heading towards the exit of the cave, and explained that they would torture her to death and then leave her in the forest.
Тэйхун оттолкнул девушку в сторону и раздраженно спросил, есть ли у них там ресторан.
And the woman's remains will become undead.
Парень продолжал есть, не обращая внимания на приближающегося и зовущего его Тахана. Он ел и ел с блаженством, закрыв глаза, не обращая ни на что внимания.
A few hours later, they returned to the temple closer to evening. Once in the temple, our hero immediately sat down with a pile of rather old books. While the others were busy with Morgana, he managed to steal a couple of books without being noticed.
Хано, глядя на это со слезами на глазах, в ужасе закрыла лицо рукой. Тахан лишь раздраженно посмотрел на это, не чувствуя никаких угрызений совести за содеянное.
So he decided to find out as much information about it as possible. His thoughts also revolved around thoughts of a staged suicide. The only ones capable of this, in the opinion of our hero, were his brothers.
Конг-У внезапно закричал о своей кимчи-джига, глядя на пролитый на пол суп. А затем он упал на четвереньки, все еще плача. Туну не понравилась такая бурная реакция, и громко выругавшись, он спросил, что это было.
All this time, Angelica sat on one of the benches a little further away, becoming an involuntary listener to the prince's thoughts. Words about his possible death greatly shocked the girl. She remembered the words of those around her that the prince had changed a lot, and she herself had witnessed that the skinny and short boy was the first to rush into battle every time.
Кунг-У медленно повернул голову в сторону Туна. Внутри него вспыхнула ярость.
According to Smith, the girl knew that he also took care of her parents. This act made her deeply grateful to the prince. Therefore, she could not allow her benefactor, who was now in desperate need of protection, to suffer or die. Angelica looked around and her gaze accidentally caught on a book lying nearby. Reading the title on its cover, she learned that it was a guide to imperial swordsmanship.
Температура воздуха поднялась настолько, что казалось, что еще немного, и весь дом загорится.
Clifford then continued his research and opened a new book, from which he was able to learn about the evolution of the undead. When zombies decompose, they turn into normal skeletons, but if they manage to keep their body, they become a stronger version, ghouls. The ghouls in turn turned into Dulacan, and those could already reach one of the strongest forms. A vampire. The further the undead developed, the smarter and stronger it became. Since zombies are in the dark, the mana accumulated there starts the process of their development, which is why these creatures are so eager for strong mana.
Кунг-У, проносясь мимо нее, резким движением дернулся в сторону и уклонился от атаки. Из тыльной стороны руки Канг-У появилось черное лезвие, которым он замахнулся для удара.
It was during these times that they called the Death Wave December 25th, the day when the king of the land of the dead, Amun, died. Was the day when all the undead went to the land of dead spirits to return to their lives. At this point, Cliff closed the book, thinking that there was less than a month left until the Death Wave and Morgana was planning it for this day with the help of zombies. Suddenly, Angelica appeared next to him and said that she would help him if he gave her the book. The prince, without thinking for long, handed her the book he had just read. He watched the girl leave. He couldn't understand why she continued to come here every day, even though no one asked her to.
С самого начала клинок и этот удар были не более чем отвлечением. Думая об этом, Тахон старался побыстрее прийти в себя.
Cliff sighed, deciding that it shouldn't bother him, because he knew perfectly well that sooner or later she would leave here. News that Smith had adopted her and that Angelique now had a home to return to reached him quickly enough. He smiled faintly at the thought that, although Smith looked sloppy, he was actually a nice guy. Suddenly, the doors of the temple swung open and several people dressed in the armor of holy knights appeared on the threshold. The cold green gaze of one of the knights was directed straight at our hero. Clifford was greatly surprised to see such uninvited guests. A few minutes later, Dan, the second in command of the Holy Knights, removed his helmet and approached the prince, saying that they had heard rumors that he had captured a witch named Morgana. Cliff noted with displeasure the rude behavior of the knight, who did not even simply say hello to him. But it wasn't even this that caused him discontent. The knight's words about the rumors that had reached them made it clear to him that he had been under surveillance all this time. The prince cautiously replied that he and the villagers had indeed caught the woman and asked if there was any problem with that. But Dan merely shook his head and replied that he had simply come to verify the truth of the rumors. Afterwards, the knight began to tell the details of these rumors, starting with the fact that Cliff bravely fought together with the villagers against a crowd of undead, which the prince did not deny. However, the next words about how they killed the king of beasts with ordinary garden tools made our hero a little surprised. Dan continued, saying that a man named Smith killed over 30 zombies and cornered a witch with holy water. Noticing the puzzled expression on Clifford and Angelica's faces, the knight explained that Smith had told them about it himself. Then he turned his gaze to one of the windows and admitted that at first he thought that it was all greatly exaggerated. However, When he personally saw the traces of a fierce battle, he was convinced that this was true. When Dan asked if the prince knew that Morgana was part of the Dark Church, he replied that he had heard about it from her, and added that she spoke as if it was some kind of secret. The knight nodded and explained that the Dark Church was a rather vicious organization.
И мрачным голосом он сказал, что ему придется заплатить за перевернутую кимчуччигу.
When Clifford learned about this, he was shocked. He didn't even imagine that someone could be behind this. Dan asked with some incredulity if they had really gotten rid of the witch, to which the prince replied that Morgana had been beaten to death and her body thrown away. When asked if this was his doing, the hero asked in surprise what kind of strength he needed to have to do something like that. Although it was actually him, Clifford had no intention of revealing his abilities. So, in order not to give himself away to the knights, he decided to follow Sam's version. With feigned weakness, the prince fell into the arms of Angelica, who had come up to him, and said that he had almost given his soul to his ancestors out of fear. The knights who watched this scene were truly perplexed. Dan sighed and asked if he knew anything about the witch's magic books. But Clifford looked away and asked what books exactly he was talking about. When the knight explained that they were supposed to take all the books on dark magic, but for some reason Morgana's bookshelf was empty. Here, our hero, as the main criminal, could not just jump off and push everything onto Sam.
И когда он скажет «два», он ответит благословенным блюдом и ничем другим. Тахун положил дрожащие руки на пол.
Dan accepted this answer and, thanking the prince for his help, handed him a bag of coins. Cliff was very surprised at the sight of the money, which was immediately reflected on his face. Noticing his reaction, the knight explained that it was a reward for Morgana's head. The prince recovered from his shock and, approaching him, hesitantly scratched the back of his head and said that he was simply doing his duty. When he was told that he should share this money with other villagers, the hero smiled tensely and promised to do so.
Не в силах смотреть в безумные глаза парня, смотревшего на него, он сказал, что это благословенное блюдо.
However, the knight's next words that they should immediately collect their things plunged our heroes into shock and bewilderment.
Он громко крикнул ему, чтобы тот произнес эти слова еще громче, как верующий, молящийся Богу, и как мужчина, заботящийся о своей девушке.
Clifford was truly surprised and did not understand at all whether the knights continued to care for him because he was a prince or there was some other reason. So he asked with a fake smile on his face where exactly they were planning to evacuate him. Back to the imperial palace or to the warm south. But Dan cut off the flow of his dreams with one dry answer.
Ее брат со слезами на глазах пытался выполнить приказ, но у парня все было не так.
Clifford knew it was half a day's drive away, so he asked, confused, if there was any point in evacuating if they were going to be in the land of the dead anyway. But Dan replied that it made sense because Lopin's estate was a fortress that was built to stop the death wave. The knight also added that they had gathered all the soldiers and prisoners to fight back the zombies. When he saw the flash of guess on the prince's face, he nodded and said that there would be many victims, and therefore asked Clifford to ask him to hold the funeral there.
Парень, сидевший над его головой, наконец успокоился, и после этих слов все стихло.
Neither he nor Angelica had the slightest desire to go to this estate, but they had no other choice. So half a day later, at the gates of the estate, they were met by a gray-haired man with a welcoming smile on his face. It was the owner of the estate, Viscount George Lopin. When he asked about his health, the prince, who looked no better than a zombie, sarcastically replied that he was fine. Confused by his terrible appearance, the man asked if the journey had been difficult, whereupon Clifford, passing him, replied discontentedly that the carriage had been very uncomfortable. Immediately after this, George began asking the prince's companions who they were.
Вся сломанная мебель была сложена в коробке и стояла у входа, ожидая вывоза на свалку.
Clifford didn't really understand why he, an exiled prince, was treated so well and the real reason for his presence in this fortress, which also had another name, the Sacrificial Fortress.
Хан Соул, который это делал, грустно посмотрел на женщину.
The castle was saved from the wave of death only by the erected walls, which could protect against zombies for only 1 month. So they had to use all possible means to survive. Walking through the courtyard of the fortress, Cliff noticed out of the corner of his eye a crowd of tied-up men dressed in fairly light clothing nearby. He couldn't help but ask if these prisoners would be sent to the front lines. Dan, who was following him, replied that this was indeed the case and that all they needed from the prince was help with the wounded and funerals. The hero wanted to say that there would be no problems with this when he heard the shocking words of the knight that more than 2,000 or 3,000 people died here every year. The amazed prince asked with a faint hope in his voice if he would have assistance. Dan nodded slightly and replied that they had about 80 priests who could perform the purification ritual. He also added that the soldiers would also help with the funeral, so Cliff had no reason to worry. At the words that sometimes people can die from overwork, which is the order of things here, our hero stopped. When he called out to George, he immediately turned around. The next moment, Clifford shouted loudly that he wanted a drink.
Кунг-У, не глядя в его сторону, равнодушно спросил, считает ли он Кунг-У сумасшедшим, если он так реагирует только из-за какого-то Ким-Чич-Чига. Парень испуганно ответил.
A few minutes later, the prince saw two maids carrying a bottle of red wine each and said that Angelica and Smith could also have some fun and relax. Afterwards, he took 2 bottles of alcohol and headed into the room. But he came to his senses and said that they should return before the death wave began, because they needed to protect him. Immediately after these words, he disappeared behind the door of his room, slamming the door. All 4 of them stood at the door for a few more minutes, each thinking about their own things. Left alone, Cliff breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that he had played just fine. Then he looked down at the wine in his hands, which he had no intention of drinking. He touched his fingers to one of the bottles, activating the holy power. The wine in it literally in one instant turned from red to sky blue, turning into holy water.
Кунг-Ву подошел ближе и схватил парня за воротник футболки.
With these thoughts, he turned the last bottle of wine into holy water. Thinking that this way he would also improve his control of his powers, he couldn't help but glance around the room and something caught his eye.
Тун перестал издавать какие-либо звуки и теперь бессильно наблюдал за происходящим перед... Кану активировал силу демона Арабобороса, силу страха.
The prince came closer and took the gun in his hands. He had previously read that there were firearms in this world, but he did not think that he would be able to get it so soon.
Тахун посмотрел прямо в глаза монстру и умолял его не трогать его, но тот, казалось, не слушал.
And firearms were used only for entertainment. But Clifford knew the explanation for this too. The whole point was that the gun needed to be loaded with holy water or a considerable amount of mana instead of gunpowder. Even the most experienced mages can only fire 5 times before they are completely exhausted.
Парень зловеще ухмыльнулся, глядя на Тахуна, и велел ему никому не рассказывать о том, что там произошло.
Deciding to try the gun out, the prince removed the safety catch. And then, quickly creating a bullet using holy water, he took aim, imagining a zombie in front of him.
Хано, увидев, как он вышел, молча взглянул в сторону Конг-У.
A smile appeared on his face, and a pleasant feeling of joy spread through his chest from the realization that he had succeeded.
Парень тем временем не обращал на нее никакого внимания, уткнувшись лицом в телефон. Он спокойно пролистывал ленту и иногда щелкал пальцем по экрану.
This state of the deputy captain of the Knights did not go unnoticed by others.
С этими мыслями о том, что ему нужно найти работу, потому что ему нужны деньги, он начал листать ленту в 2 раза активнее, не обращая внимания на девушку, которая смотрела на него, как на божество.
But he slowly turned to them and said in a cold, stern voice that they had better not wag their tongues, but look after the prisoners if they did not want to lose their positions. Having quickly apologized, the guards retreated from here, leaving Dan alone. He sighed in irritation and turned away, reluctantly admitting that they were right about his condition being directly related to the 7th prince. Last night he had clearly heard some incredibly loud noise, and now thinking about it did not give him a moment of peace. His attempt to find out what had happened was unsuccessful. A slightly battered Clifford, who had peeked out from behind the door of his bedroom, only playfully looked away and asked him not to invade the sensitive teenager's personal space. Dan was closer to the truth than ever when he walked with complete confidence that the prince had broken something right past the wall that had been damaged during yesterday's experiment. He was sure that Clifford had not changed at all and had only been hiding his true face all this time. As soon as he arrived at the village at the foot of the temple, the first thing he did was find the village headman, who convinced him that their 7th prince had changed greatly in his behavior and character after his suicide attempt and had even saved them. The deputy captain of the Knights listened with a degree of distrust to all the merits attributed to the prince by the residents, making a note to himself to be sure to check everything. Dan was now convinced that Clifford had been blackmailing all these villagers into saying completely untrue things about him in order to get back to the castle as quickly as possible. He was also tormented by another question. How could this worthless prince defeat such a powerful necromancer? Suddenly he remembered Smith, who, according to the information he had heard, was very strong, and he decided that he needed to find out more about him and perhaps write a letter of recommendation so that he could pass the examination for the title of knight. It was with these thoughts that he continued on his way. However, a sudden loud scream instantly brought him back to reality and made him wary. Pressing himself against the wall, he cautiously looked out from behind it. The assumption flashed through his head that the prisoners had rebelled again. As the screams grew louder, Dan ran out from around the corner and shouted angrily in a commanding tone for them to stop immediately. But when he saw in front of him absolutely not prisoners, he was very surprised. Clifford stood over the other guy, holding the point of his shovel to his throat, and asked him with a very menacing tone in his voice if he knew who he was. Our prince was not able to rest for long, because on the very next day of his arrival in the fortresses, people began to die from illness and overwork. So from the very morning, he, cursing with discontent, armed with a shovel, dug holes for the corpses. Around his neck hung a raven mask that had a cleansing spell cast on it to prevent infection. Sighing, Clifford straightened up and stared into the distance ahead, wondering how soon his workload would increase due to the deaths of those unfortunate souls who had been sent to the front lines. Suddenly he heard someone call his name and looked back, wiping the sweat from his chin.
Парень ответил, что надеется, что у нее все получится, и спросил. Когда они съедут, Ханул сказала, что теперь она соберется и сможет ехать. Парень думал, пока ждал ее, 10 тысяч лет он видел демонов, а потом встретил ангела.
The prince could not hide his bewilderment upon hearing this, and the count's successor, who noticed this, explained that people were usually sent here as a disciplinary punishment. Clifford grimaced in displeasure as Alex and his boys, quietly chuckling, began to discuss the fact that children from noble families could quite easily get exemption from punishment.
В аду, полном сильных демонов, он был слабым человеком на самом дне. Чтобы выжить в таком месте, ему пришлось стать расчетливым.
He turned his keen gaze to the side and said that he would not have come all this long way if he had not been looking for a servant. Immediately noticing the unusual silver hair of Angelica, who was helping the knights nearby, Alex pointed at her and said sarcastically that she would be perfect for this role. The girl herself, completely immersed in her work, did not even suspect the impending threat. The heir to the duchy grinned smugly, loudly declaring that he had already set his sights on her, and made several comments about her unusual appearance and good figure. Clifford, standing next to him, frowned and looked at Alex with genuine bewilderment. He sighed wearily, deciding that digging graves was much more pleasant than enduring the presence of these windbags, and turned around. Alex immediately noticed this. Our prince had barely taken a couple of steps when he suddenly froze, and his eyes widened in surprise. Turning slightly, he saw that Angelica, with a confused expression on her face, approached Alex, who had called her over. The heir suddenly stood up from his seat and grabbed the girl by the hand. She watched in amazement as the basket of sweet potatoes fell to the ground with a thud, and Alex, squeezing her hand a little tighter, mockingly said that she would be better off having fun with him and his boys, rather than with her master, who was busy with graves. Frowning, Angelica replied that she had no time for that now and tried to pull her hand away. But the guy did not allow her to do this, asking with the same intonation whether she really did not understand at all what was happening. However, the girl was not as simple as he thought and could stand up for herself. So the next moment she grabbed Alex's hand, holding her, and squeezed it hard. When the unnatural crunch of broken bones was heard, a loud, painful cry from the air was heard. A few moments later, Angelica finally let go of the guy, and he, throwing a hateful look at her, loudly shouted that he should have guessed right away that a commoner like her had nothing to show except brute force. At this point, Clifford decided it was time to intervene and, with a tired sigh, said that Alex should stop. But he did not hear him, and with even more hatred and aggression in his voice, he shouted that from Angelica's very appearance, it was already clear what monstrous creatures her parents were. This phrase touched the girl, and the prince did not miss it, while Alex, completely blind to everything around him, continued to spit venom in her direction. Cliff slowly approached him with a shovel raised to strike, the intent to kill clearly visible in his gaze. It was only when the tip of the shovel passed a few centimeters past his face that Alex stopped mid-sentence and froze in place with a shocked expression on his face. The shovel itself sank into the ground near his feet.
Ему показалось, что оно намного больше, чем здание международного аэропорта Ина. Невероятно, что в самом центре города построили здание таких размеров. Страшно даже представить, сколько денег в это вложено. Окликнула его Хан Соул, доставая что-то из сумки, сказав, что у нее есть для него что-то особенное.
As soon as Alex opened his mouth to express his displeasure, the prince, without holding back at all, punched him in the face. The count's heir fell onto the cold ground, flying slightly to the side. When Clifford pinned him to the ground with his foot, not allowing him to rise, he asked our hero, with poorly concealed fear in his voice and still stuttering, how he could allow himself to do such a thing, knowing full well about his personality. The exiled prince asked him in return whether Alex knew who was in front of him now. At that moment, someone's loud cry was heard, ordering them to stop. Dan instantly walked up to the guys and pushed Clifford aside and, with undisguised displeasure and contempt, asked if he had already forgotten about his punishment and decided to make trouble again. Seeing the Holy Knight, Alex immediately demanded punishment for his offender, saying that he dared to hit him. The eldest son of the Count, Angelica, tried to stand up for the prince, shouting that everything was completely wrong. But the knight ignored the girl's words and said that he could not let Clifford get away with what happened. Quite irritated by this situation, the hero put 2 fingers to his lips and released his holy power, which instantly enveloped everyone in invisible chains when he whispered only one word: silence. Dan was shocked when he realized that he couldn't say a word.
Парень с удивлением посмотрел на купон в автомате, который повторил ему необходимость взять купон и пройти в комнату для тестирования. Талант в его руках сильно дрожал, что удивило его еще больше. Внезапно под его ногами появился свет, и машина снова повторила свою очередь.
For a few moments, a tense silence hung between them. The knight was at a loss due to such a sudden change in the guy's behavior. But pulling himself together, he looked at Alex and said that Clifford Socket was the 7th prince of the empire and the grandson of the Holy Emperor. These words shocked the heir of the Duke. The hero noticed his reaction and, folding his arms across his chest, said that now Alex should understand who he had disrespected and whose maid he had been rude to. The guy, trembling with fear, could not utter a word. Clifford smiled kindly and said that if he apologized sincerely, there would be no problem. However, everything did not go quite as our hero had expected, and he was thrown into the fortress dungeon.
Парень прочитал статьи и задумался. 5 великих гильдий. Ким Джей Хун из Мир, Чионджу из Ред Роуз, Бек Канган из Ханвелл, Чэнь Хуну из Анари и Чаман.
Eventually, unable to bear it any longer, Alex lost consciousness and was carried on a stretcher to the hospital wing. The girl looked down guiltily and said that it was her fault that Clifford was locked up here for a whole week. But the hero sighed and said that she shouldn't worry about it, because it all happened only because of that idiot.
Чем сильнее вы становитесь, тем больше у вас врагов. Есть большая вероятность, что у него может возникнуть конфликт с ними.
Lost in his thoughts, the deputy captain of the Holy Knights was on one of the walls of the fortress when an excited guard ran up to him. He informed him that, as ordered, the prisoners had begun clearing the snow. But because the blizzard was too strong, they were not able to do it in time. But Dan didn't listen to the guard at all, continuing to think about how the good-for-nothing 7th prince was able to use holy power. After calling him several times, the guard finally managed to bring him out of his stormy stream of thoughts. The knight looked down at the prisoners working below and said that they needed to continue clearing the snow to maintain the height of the fortress walls. He couldn't help but notice that even though the frost had already set in, there weren't that many zombies. When the guard asked whether he should inform the family of the Holy Emperor about this, Dan replied that it was only for the best and asked that all the prisoners be gathered. Hastening to carry out his order, he climbed the bell tower and rang the bell several times.
Не колеблясь, он положил руки на камень, который тут же начал слегка светиться. А затем он начал дуть ярким белым светом, ослепившим его глаза. Конгу закрыл глаза, подумав, что это, пожалуй, даже слишком ярко.
But only 2 people managed to return alive, and priests immediately ran to them. One of the prisoners said that the zombies attacked them from behind, and because of a strong snowstorm, they were unable to detect the approaching enemy in time. Therefore, everyone who was there was eaten, and only the 2 of them miraculously managed to return back to the fortress. Dan now understood the reason why it had been so quiet until now, because very soon the day of the death of the King of the Dead would come, and thousands of dead people would come here. The fortress guards grabbed their weapons and began to climb the walls to prepare for defense. The knight captain's deputy looked around warily as the horrifying realization struck him that the zombies had managed to suppress their instincts and hide under the snowdrifts. He knew perfectly well that the undead were dead people, and they were completely unafraid of anything and relied only on their instincts. Before this, they had dealt with them quite easily every year, since none of the undead carried weapons or used any strategies. Suddenly, Dan saw a crowd of zombies approaching the fortress. Each of their steps was accompanied by loud drum beats. Hundreds of zombies were moving in an endless stream closer and closer to their target. The knight was shocked by what he saw, as he expected. This time everything was different. The zombies had not only tactics, but also equipment.
Она собиралась сказать, что ей нужно сделать, чтобы записаться на базовое обучение, когда Конг-У прервал ее и сказал, что в этом нет необходимости. Он не собирался получать базовые знания.
A few moments later, the knight could see a stretcher carrying several small zombies on its shoulders. And on them, as if on a throne, sat a terrible creature. who declared that he was the judge of this world and the Messiah who would save the world through death, being a follower of the god of death. This creature, to whom all the undead that crouched here were subordinate, was a vampire count with a high level of necromancy.
Взгляд девушки упал на камень, от которого только что отошел Кун-У. Она не могла понять, что с ним происходит.
He slammed the book shut and put it back into his inventory, wondering what was going on outside. With these thoughts, he approached a small window and tried to see at least something from behind the bars. Suddenly, he heard the Viscount's excited voice calling out to him, and, tearing his gaze away from the window, he sighed wearily, saying that he was not trying to escape from the dungeon, but, to his surprise, the man, on the contrary, shouted for Clifford to quickly get out of here.
Даже в прошлый раз, когда Бэк Конг-Хун получил S-уровень, у него был только темно-серый цвет, а здесь он не темно-серый, а настоящий черный. Такого никогда не было. Она громко кричала, чтобы сломанный мяч заменили новым.
Watching the movement of George's hands, he asked in confusion if there really weren't enough workers in the fortress. And quickly losing his composure because of this whole situation, he shouted that it wasn't that. The vampire had brought a whole horde of zombies. These words plunged the prince into genuine shock. When Cliff asked if they were imagining things, the man replied that the monster spoke their language and controlled other undead. Afterwards, he opened the door, releasing our hero to freedom, and added that he himself did not know what exactly had happened, and that the Holy Knight Dan was now trying to take control of the situation. Clifford's face showed a slight worry when the Viscount admitted that the fortress could fall very soon, so they needed to evacuate to a safer place. But before our hero could leave his cell, stones began to rain down, and the next moment the walls shook. Clifford looked up in confusion and asked what was going on. Instead of answering, the agitated Viscount said that they should quickly leave through the back door.
Пройдя через портал, он устало наклонился и сказал, он боялся, что снова попадет в ад, но ему все равно не нравится этот способ передвижения, так как он вызывает неприятные ощущения.
Suddenly there was a terrible roar and the wall was broken through by these zombies. The Viscount and the prince looked ahead in bewilderment, completely not understanding what was happening. Zombies from the pile with glowing eyes crawled towards them. At that very moment, surprised cries were heard from outside that the vampire had thrown a whole bunch of zombies into their group and that the undead had invaded the fortress territory. What they heard plunged our heroes into real horror. Clifford quickly pulled himself together and armed himself with a shovel, afraid to even imagine what was happening outside.
И они ахнули, когда он ответил «нет» и продолжил разговаривать с парнем. Он явно имел власть в партии. Все тут же замолчали, и дрожь пробежала по телу каждого из них.
The man shouted that he would send for help and soon disappeared around the corner. The prince clenched his teeth harder, wondering what he should do now. Before this, he had successfully dealt with everything because the monsters were not of a very high level. But now, the number of opponents was too great for him. Coming to the conclusion that in such a situation he could only flee, Clifford released his divine power. The next moment, the zombies screamed in pain as their bodies began to hiss from contact with the holy power. As soon as all the corpses fell limply to the floor, the prince sighed with relief and entered the chamber. He was going to take advantage of this opportunity and get outside as soon as possible. A cold gust of wind greeted him outside. Cliff looked up and began to look around. But as soon as he did this, he froze in place, amazed. It was a real hell all around. Zombies pounced on the guards trying to resist and sank their teeth deep into the fresh flesh.
Со словами благодарности за то, что он предложил, но заверил его, что с ним все будет хорошо, он все взвесил и обдумал.
Having quickly dealt with their previous victims, the zombies immediately rushed towards this crowd of people. Clifford watched what was happening in horror. He gripped his shovel tighter in his hand, thinking that he wouldn't be able to hold out for long. But doing nothing wasn't an option either.
Эти гоблины сильно отличаются от других как внешним видом, так и размерами.
And then he hit her on the ground with all his might. The prince tensed his entire body, concentrating his holy power and trying to spread the blessing over as large a radius as possible.
И он стал смотреть, как они прячутся в лесу, думая, что если он действительно еще зеленый, то пойдет.
Many drops of water, like rain, began to fall back to the ground.
Сказав, что пора отправляться в путь, он еще более легкой походкой двинулся вглубь леса.
When the holy water hit the zombies' bodies, it burned away their sinister energy. Hissing and screaming in pain, the zombies were completely distracted from the fight, clutching at their own heads in an instinctive attempt to ease the pain a little. The guards' faces showed surprise and joy as they saw the zombies literally melting in the rain, and all the wounds people received quickly healed. The latter helped people realize that it was not rain that was pouring from the sky, but holy water. and they decided that it was the gods themselves who had given their blessing. However, among the crowd there was a man who understood that the gods had nothing to do with it, but their seventh prince, and he informed the others about this. Everyone else followed his gaze and saw pillars of holy water swirling around the prince's body.
Темная энергия влилась в левую руку Конг-У, и из его левого запястья появилось черное лезвие. Он тут же начал рубить остальных гоблинов.
Watching him, everyone present was amazed. However, they understood that although Clifford was an exiled prince, he was also the grandson of the hero who stopped the king of the dead spirits, Aemon, 500 years ago. Suddenly, the silence was cut by the guard's voice, asking the residents if anyone needed help, and if so, he asked them to follow him. These words brought happy smiles to their faces.
Несколькими движениями он отсек им шеи, и головы существ упали с плеч.
Already barely able to stand on his feet, Clifford waved at them with one hand and said with difficulty that he had simply summoned rain inside the fortress.
Хотя они изо всех сил пытались поймать его и убить, из-за его скорости это казалось невыполнимой задачей.
But Cliff's next words about how they should now go and help the Holy Knight left them genuinely perplexed, since they didn't have any suitable weapons. The hero nodded his head, confirming this fact, and added that it was for this reason that he was giving them a blessing. And he also did not forget to warn them that, since he was doing this for the first time, he did not know how long this effect would last. The next moment, the knight's weapons were engulfed in a blue glow. When it disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, one of the knights looked at the prince and asked in confusion what exactly had changed, to which the hero wearily replied that their weapons were now less useless.
Их судьба не остановила живых гоблинов, которые сделали то же самое.
They all understood perfectly well that they would have to fight to the last for their right to continue living in this world, and that they had no other choice. At the same time, a real massacre was taking place at the gates of the fortress. As soon as the knights sent by Clifford arrived at the scene, one of the zombies immediately rushed at them. Mike pulled himself together in time and made a chopping swing, aiming at the monster's head. The knights looked at their weapons with a mixture of surprise and admiration, because they barely touched the zombies, but were able to inflict such severe damage in literally one instant. Mike's spirits perked up, and he confidently shouted out that with such equipment, these zombies were nothing to them. Just when they believed that they had a chance to win, because the descendant of the legendary hero was with them, a new threat appeared before them, much more terrible and dangerous than ordinary zombies: the Dullahan, a headless hell rider. The spear woven from dark energy that the monster threw swept away everything in its path, heading straight for its target. Right before Mike's eyes, all of his comrades died in the blink of an eye. When the Dullahan stopped next to him, the knight, trembling with horror and fear, fell powerlessly to the ground and began to slowly move back. Tears welled up in his eyes, and a clear realization came to his mind that they would never defeat this monster when the tip of a black spear appeared in front of his face. At the last moment, as befits a true hero, Clifford appeared with a gun in his hands. He aimed it straight at the creature in front of him and apologized to the guard for the delay. Immediately after these words, a loud shot rang out. Moore was able to sense the energy of life, and it was thanks to this that he could now see every living person in this fortress. And he was exhausted with the desire to finally, after many decades, enjoy fresh meat. As he thought about this, he couldn't help but imagine how delicious their blood would taste and how much more powerful his zombie regiment would become with the new additions to its ranks. Moore patiently waited for this opportunity for about 100 years, going all the way from a soulless zombie living only by instincts to a ghoul, from a ghoul to a Dullahan, and then to a lord.
Его источником определенно были не магические камни, он чувствовал его внутри их тел.
The path he had taken was incredibly difficult, but it was not over yet, because he was still not recognized by other vampires. But Moore was completely confident in himself.
И все это не могло не доставить ему большого удовольствия.
Thanks to him, Moore was going to collect an incredible amount of mana in a short time and stand at the head of all currently existing vampires.
Он собирал кристаллы и вслух размышлял о том, сколько курицы он сможет заказать, если продаст все эти камни.
Even holy water did not cause him any harm now, so he was completely confident that he would capture this fortress today and grow his army. Moore looked forward to this sweet moment with great impatience, watching what was happening. Meanwhile, the guards who had climbed the wall began to attack the enemy behind the walls, firing arrows and spears. Dan commanded the knights as they rushed frantically from side to side, ordering them to keep firing and not allow more undead to break through. He knew things were already going badly because the zombies were already in the fortress, so he tried to make sure things didn't get any worse. While continuing to give orders, The knight could not stop worrying about the inhabitants of the fortress. He could only guess and hope that everything was okay with them, because now he could not hand over command to anyone else, because the enemy army was too close and the situation was close to critical. His fingers tightened on the hilt of his sword as Dan allowed the thought that everyone inside might already be dead. He was confused and had absolutely no idea what to do, because if his worst guess turned out to be true, then all his actions would be meaningless. Suddenly, a noise was heard behind him, attracting the attention of the Holy Knight. Turning around, he saw Angelica in front of him. She told the man that the inhabitants of the fortress were all right because the prince was with them. Gripping the spears and swords in her hands a little tighter, Angelica confidently said that she would also do her best to protect the place where Clifford was.
Глядя на него, парень со страхом подумал, что тот использует настоящий...
But he could not refuse her. As soon as she heard words of approval, she unclenched her hands and all the weapons, except for one single sword, fell to the floor with a clang. As the knight looked at the pile of weapons in confusion, Angelica explained that she had heard that he wanted the weapons to be moved to the walls of the fortress. All this time, Dan thought that she was a simple servant of the seventh prince, but now he strongly doubted it, because he understood perfectly well that even experienced warriors could not carry so many weapons at once, let alone a fragile teenage girl.
Гоблин тем временем с громким ревом замахнулся на него кинжалом.
Then he turned his gaze back to the enemy army, trying to rein in his emotions and convince himself that they would cope with this, no matter what it took. In the worst-case scenario, he was going to personally break through the entire army of undead and cut off the head of the vampire sitting on his throne. Meanwhile, the giant zombies once again loaded the catapult with a lump of several dozen zombies.
Конг-У поднял левую руку и поднял клинок, чтобы заблокировать атаку хобгоблина.
A whole crowd of undead was flying straight towards them at breakneck speed. Reacting quickly, the deputy commander of the Holy Knights shielded the girl standing behind him, shouting that it was too dangerous here. He then ran his free hand along the blade of his sword, saying a quick prayer to the god of war to strengthen his sword with holy power. However, Angelica got ahead of him, and without a drop of fear or doubt in her eyes, she boldly rushed forward. Releasing her sword from its sheath, she cut the flying pile of things in half with one swing. Dan covered his head with his hands, protecting himself from the zombie pieces flying down.
И он размахнулся, ударив огромного монстра одним из ножей и ранив его.
The shocked knight looked around in bewilderment, completely unable to understand how she did it. Although not all the zombies died from this attack, the survivors could not even get to their feet. He tried to understand how this was even possible, because he knew very well that the undead could only be stopped by aiming at the head or using weapons with holy water or holy power. So the only explanation he could come up with was that among that pile of weapons, there was a rather unusual sword, which the girl was lucky enough to take. Meanwhile, Angelica bravely broke through the crowd of undead, leaving behind only a bloody trail of severed bodies. Watching her movements closely, Dan noted with displeasure that her sword strikes were too sloppy and sharp, and that they were too conspicuous. It was also evident that she used muscle power to compensate for her poor skills, and it is precisely due to this that it breaks forward. After analyzing what he saw, Dan came to the conclusion that it was not about the sword at all, as he had previously assumed, and was almost completely sure that Angelica's technique belonged to the imperial art of swordsmanship, which was passed on to the Holy Cross detachment. Deciding to make sure of this, he called out to her. In a serious tone with a hint of suspicion, he asked where she had learned to do this, and asked if she was a member of the Holy Imperial family. To this, the girl replied that she was a simple assistant to the seventh prince.
Этот босс определенно отличался от гоблинов, которых он не... Парень строго посмотрел на него.
When Angelica, deciding that the conversation was over, ran on, Dan frowned with displeasure because he had heard absolutely nothing of what she told him. Fresh supplies of holy water were constantly brought into the basement, where a temporary shelter had been set up to heal the wounded. When the surprised Viscount asked where all these vessels came from, the guard replied that the prince had given them all to him, saying that he had taken a supply of holy water with him just in case. Hearing this, the man sighed with relief and asked where the prince himself was now.
Гоблин повернулся в его сторону, но его отвлекло что-то, брошенное им позади себя.
Noticing the Viscount's reaction to these words, the guard hesitated slightly and hesitantly admitted that he had assumed that the prince had already received permission for this. George sighed again, and then looked around the room and said that it was not at all that he did not trust the seventh prince, especially when everyone was praising him so much now. The real reason for this man's worries was the question of whether anyone would remain within the fortress walls. At the same time, the undead, dressed in guard armor, hiding their faces, quickly climbed the walls where the main action was now taking place. Noticing their appearance, the guard standing there became confused, trying to determine whether they were an enemy or a friend. Cliff, who hid his face behind a raven mask, read all the thoughts on the guard's face and answered, to a question that had not yet been asked to him, that he had brought reinforcements. Hearing this, the man relaxed and admitted that he was surprised that anyone was still alive. Because the situation at the main gate was not at all encouraging, the prince nodded and replied that it was for this reason that he sent some troops to the walls. Since there was much more trouble at the gate, our hero was confident that no one would look into the faces of the warriors subordinate to him. He had previously given away all the holy water and ended up not having enough to use the new skill, so he had to resort to another plan. In order to create an army of ghost soldiers, he needed to raise the old soldiers and take control of them, which required a lot of effort and was too difficult. Instead, he simply used the corpses he already had. And so that no one would suspect anything, he ordered the zombies to cover their faces, otherwise there would be even more chaos and everything would come to an end. The guard's words about how he should have stayed in the rear pulled Clifford out of his memories, and he replied that he had a couple of things to do on the way here. He then pointed to the gun in his hand, saying that he wanted to use it. He completely ignored the man's words about the weapon being useless in this situation and walked closer to the fence, noting along the way that the view was much better from here. The entire enemy army was as if in the palm of his hand. Having easily discovered the main enemy in the person of the vampire, he took aim at him. Clifford closed one eye as he took aim and quietly said that now was the time to let the enemy experience the divine blessing. Noticing the approaching deputy commander, the knight stopped and asked what had happened. Dan replied that he had learned that the evacuation had already ended, which is why he had come here. Taking his sword out of its sheath, he said that he would also help here. The knight nodded and began to fill his commander in on the details of what was happening, saying that they had managed to more or less take control of the situation.
Он закричал, как будто был вне себя, и упал на землю.
And some fighters had less skills than the holy knights and they came as reinforcements. Dan listened to his subordinate's story with bewilderment. Although he had already seen Angelica's extraordinary strength a little earlier, such a large number of oddities left him stupefied. Sighing, he simply replied that he was glad that the situation hadn't gotten any worse, at which point Ethan, cutting down another zombie, admitted that they still didn't know what to do with the vampire. While also cutting down the monster, Dan asked how things were with ranged weapons. The knight replied resignedly that they used everything they could, arrows and stones, to attack the enemy. However, they all broke against the magical protective barrier, never reaching their target. When Ethan mentioned a gun loaded with holy water, Dan expressed disappointment that it was useless because it would not be able to penetrate the shield created by the vampire. At the thought that he would actually have to break through this horde of undead for lack of any other way out, he cursed silently. But this option also seemed almost unrealistic to the knight, because they couldn't even fight off zombies properly, let alone say anything more. The voice of Ethan standing next to him pulled him out of his thoughts. He pointed somewhere ahead and said with amazement in his voice that ordinary priests were not capable of such a thing. Dan looked around to see what exactly was being discussed and immediately froze in place in shock. Clifford, standing on the wall, actively read a prayer to the goddess of love and mercy, begging for salvation and permission to use the power to punish the undead. Although the deputy captain of the Holy Knights could not hear the words of the prayer from such a distance, he could clearly see a figure standing behind the prince, emitting a blindingly bright light.
Он положил руку на тело хобгоблина, активируя способность пожирания.
And Dan couldn't believe his eyes. It was not difficult for him to realize that the man on the wall had received a blessing sent down by the goddess herself. Previously, he could only hear about such a thing, because even the most experienced priests rarely receive such an honor. And today he saw it with his own eyes for the first time. When a quiet voice behind him confidently said that it was the seventh prince, the knight frowned and asked what that meant. Angelica smiled and explained that she saw his light. The knight glanced strangely at the girl standing next to him, thinking that she was talking some kind of nonsense. Then he turned his gaze back to the stranger in the mask. The idea that this was indeed the seventh prince, who had been fiercely opposing the goddess all this time, had received her blessing did not fit into his head at all. Meanwhile, Clifford pulled the trigger and fired.
Бездумно радоваться внезапному увеличению силы было нельзя. Это могло быть очень опасно.
The confident smile on Moore's face faded as cracks began to appear on his shield, growing deeper with each passing second. At some point, the bullet finally broke through the magical barrier and hit its target, causing the vampire to scream in pain. Our hero read about the methods of collecting holy power in one of the books of the Holy Emperor. Prayer was considered the most effective method. Typically, magicians use mana for their spells, priests use prayers and holy water, and necromancers use life and magical power.
Ему было интересно, будет ли с каждым повышением ослабевать сила, которая запечатала Манхва.
However, he remembered that this body belonged to the grandson of the Holy Emperor, so he did not need to resort to such sacrifices. The prince had previously considered trying to become a priest if he could use his powers without sacrificing his life, so this time he decided to take the opportunity and try. Moore screamed in pain, ordering his undead army to retreat immediately. Clifford regretted that he had not managed to kill the vampire with this blow, but he was glad that at least he had managed to buy a little time to get ready. Suddenly, something caught his attention. He saw how all the attention of the guards standing below, fighting the undead, was now directed at him. In a stupor, Cliff decided to play the fool and said that now it was time to help the wounded. Immediately after these words, he and his small army hurried to hide from prying eyes. Dan watched him closely, still wondering if it was really the prince. He had only seen Clifford as a worthless boy who deserved to be exiled, so now it was really hard to believe that he was capable of such a thing.
Он сказал, что это очень вкусно, и кивнул головой в знак согласия с тем, что вкус действительно восхитительный.
Suddenly, Dan had a flashback to how warmly the villagers had spoken of Clifford. He pursed his lips, thinking about this whole situation.
Парень закрыл глаза и задумался, в его поведении сквозила неуверенность. Курица и кимчи-чиги. Нельзя выбрать что-то одно.
That fateful day of Clifford's mother's death also marked the end of his calm and carefree life. Anna was the mother of the first and seventh princes. The highest of a small village, she was a representative of two races, the Holy Nation and the Southern Aslan, who had been at odds with each other for many hundreds of years. Because of this, many members of high society did not accept her until the very end. However, the son of the Holy Emperor fell in love with her with all his heart, and they got married, after which the first prince was born. But since the Holy Imperial family had too much influence, two ladies of noble blood were assigned to the emperor's son.
А затем молча отпил пиво.
And Anna gave birth to the seventh prince, Clifford.
Тем временем вилка упала на пол и начала раскачиваться.
During a night walk, Anna and her children were attacked by a vampire.
Кун поднял вилку с пола и лаконично ответил, что он проведет ночь где-нибудь.
And the first prince, who only miraculously managed to survive, began to suffer from a heart curse. After this, the cheerful and kind-hearted Clifford became cold and unfeeling. Some said he was so shocked that he went crazy. Dan frowned, trying to figure out if a person who lost his memory after a suicide attempt could really become his old self again.
Затем она передала ему подарок, сказав, что он понятия не имеет, насколько он им помог, поэтому ему не стоит об этом беспокоиться.
Now he was no longer concerned with the question of the prince's memory, but with the reason why he had hidden his power all this time. After thinking about this, Dan came to the most obvious conclusion that Clifford was avoiding attracting the attention of the imperial family. Based on this, a disappointing assumption arose in his mind that the prince was planning revenge. However, the knight understood this desire perfectly well, because he himself knows perfectly well that the imperial palace has never been and will never be friendly to potential heirs to the throne. And both the first and seventh princes had a hard time because of high society, which treated them with disdain. Now it also became clear to him why Clifford had only just now revealed his power. He wanted to take revenge on the vampire and the nobility for the death of his mother. Moreover, Dan was convinced that the prince had deliberately planned his exile in order to increase his power away from prying eyes. And since the Holy Knights were directly subordinate to the emperor, the reason for the cold relationship between himself and the seventh prince became obvious to him. Delving deeper into his own guesses, the knight assumed that Angelica most likely came from a noble family, where she was taught basic skills. Looking back, Dan couldn't shake the sticky feeling of guilt that haunted him. When the first prince had ordered him to call for help on that fateful day, he blamed himself and reproached himself for obeying the order, leaving them alone against a stronger enemy. No matter how much time passed, Dan was still unable to forget and ask himself for this mistake, which he would hardly ever be able to atone for. And now to all this was added the fact that the seventh prince was planning revenge. His fist involuntarily clenched as the deputy knight captain made an important decision for himself. Sighing, the man looked forward with confidence and decided that if Clifford wanted revenge, then it would be his duty to help the prince, so that he could at least a little bit atone for his guilt. But first they had to deal with Lopin. He was distracted from these thoughts by the sound of approaching footsteps. Turning around, the knight noticed a guard patrolling the wall and called out to him. When he didn't react, Dan frowned, blaming it on the noise of the wind. However, something else made him very wary, namely, the fact that the guard was wandering around in the pitch darkness without a lantern.
Девушка, вспомнив их местонахождение, ответила, что был только один, но там были люди-ящеры.
The zombie reacted to his actions and, standing in a stance, he also drew his sword.
Ему нужны монстры, которые будут повышать свой уровень быстрее и желательно как можно сильнее.
A gust of wind caused the shawl that covered the guard's face to flutter, revealing the zombie's disfigured face.
Девушка отвела его в одну из комнат, объяснив, что ее брат уже пользовался ею.
The man instantly raised his gaze, quickly determining where he was being shot from, and noticed another guard on the roof of a nearby tower with the same scarf on his face. In his hands was a bow from which these arrows were fired. Without weakening his pressure at all, Dan frowned even more. He clearly felt the demonic energy emanating from these zombies, but for some reason unknown to him, along with it, he also felt the holy power contained within them. A few moments later, he managed to push the zombie back, causing it to lose its balance and fall to the floor.
И с улыбкой он подождал, пока она не закрыла дверь и комната не погрузилась во тьму. Он потянулся и, наконец, упал обратно на мягкую кровать.
Shocked, Dan slowly lowered his sword, looking in disbelief as the zombie stopped moving and showing any signs of life, becoming more like a limp doll. Then he turned to the person standing behind him and asked what was going on. Clifford ignored the question and instead sternly asked the knight to put away his sword. As soon as the zombies under his command left, he, without giving Dan a chance to get a word in, asked him if the reshuffling of the troops was finished, because after midnight the day of King Amon's death would come, and the army of the undead would return again with renewed vigor. Dan did not give up his attempts to figure out what was going on here, so, seizing the moment, he sullenly asked the prince if he was really capable of using necromancy. For a long time, Cliff did not answer, silently studying his interlocutor with his gaze. Afterwards, he quietly said that he himself did not know how it happened. These words caused a lot of conflicting emotions in the knight's soul, and without holding back his displeasure, mixed with strong surprise, he asked the prince if he was really so desperate that he began to learn this dark art. Cliff sighed and admitted that he did indeed summon the undead to help out a little in the fight. But due to his memory loss, he himself doesn't know where he got those abilities from. Now it was Dan's turn to pierce the guy standing in front of him with a piercing gaze, under which our hero desperately prayed to all known gods that the knight would believe this and not ask unnecessary questions. Without his knowledge, the knight asked suspiciously where those zombies got their holy power from if he had made a deal with the devil, to which the prince replied, scratching his head, that he had no intention of hiding anything and suggested that he might have been interested in necromancy before. When he asked whether Dan would tell the inquisitors everything, the man looked down at the floor, thinking about the possible consequences of this action. The knight's tense silence slowly drove Clifford mad with the many thoughts of his imminent and cruel death. When he began to think through all the possible tortures that would most likely be applied to him, Dan replied that, as a knight, he was simply obliged to report this. But the next moment he fell to his knees in front of the prince, causing him no small surprise.
Хан Соул сказал, что они также боятся огня. Они говорят, что отряды огненных магов лучше всего охотятся на ящеролюдей. Парень тихо приблизился, активируя силу адского пламени, силу, принадлежавшую демону по имени Андрас.
When Dan raised his head, there was more of the same hostility and mistrust in his gaze, and he swore an oath to help and support the prince until the very end. Our hero was completely confused by what happened, because all this time he was sure that this man hated him.
Небольшое пламя перекинулось на монстров, и как только оно достигло цели, оно стало таким большим, что покрыло все тело человека-ящера.
In a voice full of suspicion and distrust, he asked the Holy Knight if this help was offered in order to strengthen control and surveillance over him. The knight rose to his feet and sadly replied that the reason was not this at all, but in the past, when he was still an ordinary child. Knowing full well where he was going, Clifford cut him off mid-sentence, saying that now they had to do what they had to do. Then he nodded towards the blood-red full moon shining in the sky, saying that the time had already come. He was fully confident that their opponents would not waste precious time when their strength was at its peak. Our hero was completely right because soon the castle walls were once again surrounded by a large army of undead. Seated on his throne, Moore raised his hands and called out to all the dead under his command. He urged them to devour humans, promising that once everything was over, they too would become kings of this world. Having finished his speech, the vampire also got down to business, taking in as much air as possible and beginning to absorb the sinister energy floating in the air. A moment later, His mouth opened wide, and Moore released an incredibly powerful stream of destructive energy. When it collided with the walls of the fortress, there was a loud roar and thick clouds of dust rose into the air. George, who had taken command of the main force, turned to the knights behind him and shouted at them to hold their positions. Alex, who by an unfortunate accident also ended up in this detachment, was shaking with horror all over his body, and his face was adorned with an unnatural pallor. Stuttering, he confessed to the Viscount that the wounds inflicted by the prince still hurt, and in this state he would be absolutely unable to do anything on the battlefield. The man looked at the guy with disappointment and involuntarily wondered if he had made the right decision. Then he looked ahead at the endless crowd of enemies approaching them, with their eyes burning with madness. At that moment, the thought flashed through his mind that perhaps he really should have simply retreated rather than redistributed his troops. Suddenly, he heard leisurely footsteps approaching. When the guards' excited cries reached his ears that the priest was here and would save them, the Viscount looked with bewilderment in his eyes at the figure of the stranger in the cloak who had stopped next to him. Clifford, without wasting any time, began to read a prayer, calling out to the goddess. At that very moment, his entire body was enveloped in a powerful stream of holy water. The water rushed upward and fell in drops onto the undead. The water splashing onto their mutilated bodies caused the zombies to howl and growl in pain. What he saw gave the Viscount confidence, and with a joyful smile on his face, he shouted out that together with the priest, they really had nothing to fear. With this attitude, the inspired warriors rushed at the enemy army. The knights bravely fought one monster after another. Dan was also among them, fighting bravely on the front lines. Using his holy power, he destroyed several opponents at once with one blow.
А затем он повернулся в другую сторону и сказал, что его это не интересует.
So he couldn't afford to miss such an opportunity. Dan was going to get as close to the vampire as possible and try to destroy him.
Он ответил, что если бы это было так, то его бы просто увезли полумертвым.
Overcome by his own rage, he jumped up from his throne, shouting angrily that he would not tolerate this any longer. Dan was closer to victory than ever before. All he had to do was strike suddenly while the monster's attention was focused on the priest.
Конг-У все еще охотился на монстров в дикой местности и на болотах, сжигая всех, кого находил.
The nearby guards froze in place, numb with horror at the scene unfolding before their eyes.
Парень, наблюдавший за ними, медленно использовал силу пожирания, чтобы высосать из них жизненную силу. Выдохнув, он подумал, что, похоже, он уже убил всех монстров в округе, и больше никого не осталось.
Clifford quickly downed another bottle of holy water. He had assumed from the very beginning that the vampire would target him first. He also knew that this monster was able to see his holy power, just as he himself saw the flows of mana. So, throwing the empty bottles aside, the prince ran forward, deciding that he should move to a better location, because the moment when he would be discovered was only a matter of time. As he approached the turn, Cliff looked back. As soon as he did this, he froze in shock at the sight of a huge boulder flying straight at him. He miraculously managed to pull himself together in time and jumped to the side as the boulder fell to the ground with a terrifying crash. As soon as the rising clouds of dust settled, Moore appeared behind our hero. Opening his mouth wide, he began to concentrate his energy for a deadly attack. But Clifford had foreseen such a development of events, and so he had prepared a plan for she in advance. Our hero closed his eyes and shouted Angelica's name as loudly as possible. At his call, the girl instantly appeared in the air holding a huge stone slab. The next moment, Moore attacked and a monstrous roar was heard around the area again, accompanied by dense clouds of dust. Clifford looked at Angelica standing in front of him with wide eyes. Using the stone slab as a shield, she protected both of them from the enemy's attack. Although the hero was glad of his salvation, he understood that they would not last long, because Moore's magic was too strong and their shield would not last long. He also knew that Angelica still hadn't learned to take control of her power, and in this situation they risked melting from the enemy's magic.
Парень, вытащивший оружие, хотел возразить, но ему сказали не беспокоиться. «Не волнуйтесь, мы все равно перевоспитаем этого грубияна», — с насмешкой сказал Хаджун.
Through clenched teeth, Smith said that although he could not fight with a sword, he was still able to help his daughter. Angelica was very shocked by his words because she never even thought that this man would really care about her so much. Suddenly, the pressure of Moore's magic became more powerful, and the cracks in the stone slab began to rapidly grow, allowing a stream of evil energy to seep further. But even despite this, Angelica and Smith continued to hold their only defense. Feeling all their wounds and abrasions begin to heal and the pain dull, they looked in surprise at the prince who had applied healing to both of them. While treating them, Cliff reflects on how he still has a hard time properly distributing and controlling his holy power. Suddenly, the wall he had destroyed came back to his mind, giving him the idea that he could try to strengthen this stone slab with his divine energy. With no other choice and no time to come up with any plan, Clifford decided to take a chance and go all in on this choice. He closed his eyes tightly and shouted out a prayer, asking the goddess to grant them protection. Suddenly, a bright flash of light enveloped the stone slab, forming a powerful protective dome around it. The holy power emanating from the dome reached even Mora, who was shocked by what was happening. When he tried to defend himself somehow, another terribly loud crash was heard among the clouds of dust. A few moments later, everything became quiet, and the silence that reigned was broken only by the sound of stones falling to the ground. Angelica quickly came to her senses, rose to her feet, and began looking for Cliff and Smith, shouting their names. Suddenly she noticed something and stopped. On the ground, surrounded by a pile of rocks, lay an unconscious Smith. The worried girl wanted to run up to the man when she was stopped by a strange hand. Clifford assured her that Smith was perfectly fine, so she shouldn't panic. Looking back, Angelica inquired about the condition of the prince himself. He honestly admitted that he was very exhausted, but overall he was not hurt. Their conversation was interrupted by the painful cries of Mora, whose body was being burned by holy power. When the prince said that now was a great chance, Angelica protested, saying that in his current state, Cliff could not continue the battle. He did not even bother to deny her words and simply explained that now was a great opportunity to escape. Angelica took Smith by the arm and followed the prince, who intended to hide underground. Moving in the right direction, the hero noted with displeasure that the holy water had run out much faster than he had expected, so now he would have to change his original plan. Suddenly running past, he noticed a skull-shaped mask lying on the ground, which was emitting dark energy. Clifford stopped dead in his tracks and, looking at her, realized that all this time the mana had been gathering not near the vampire, but near this skull. Noticing his hesitation, a surprised Angelica asked what had happened, to which the prince asked her to wait a little while he checked one thing. When he took this skull in his hands, he remembered that all this time it had been hanging around the vampire's neck. He was interested to know what functions this skull had. The next moment, in response to his mental request, a window appeared that stated that Amon's skull increased the user's magical power from 20% to 200% and added 10% to the recovery rate. Already accustomed to the hellish burning sensation throughout his body, Moore touched his head, which until recently had been adorned with a skull, thinking that he needed to recover as quickly as possible. When he realized that his relic was missing, Mora was overcome with true horror. The monster looked around and noticed Cliff standing to the side with a skull in his hands. He ran towards the prince with all his might, shouting furiously at him to give the skull back. But our hero had completely different plans for this relic, especially after he studied the stats window. Without hesitation, he placed the skull on his head.
Парень залез на дерево и насмешливо спросил, говорил ли Хаджун, что люди-ящеры чувствительны к звукам.
Moore hung in the air, never reaching the prince, as a multitude of chains reached out to him, piercing his legs and arms. Moments later, he was firmly bound by the chains of the ghostly knights and unable to move. His one eye, not engulfed in blue flame, widened in horror as he smelled the scent of death. The next moment, he was surrounded by a countless army of holy knights, all under the command of none other than Clifford. He slowly approached the chained Mora. Realizing what was happening, the vampire angrily shouted that our hero had broken the rules. The creation of the dead, endowed with sacred power and the dead with self-conceit, was contrary to the very essence of necromancers and betrayed the will of the god of death. Clifford put the barrel of a gun to his forehead, interrupting his passionate speech. Then, with a satisfied smile on his face, on behalf of the priest and heir of the holy power, he gives him his blessing.
Но его отвлекла толпа монстров, приближавшаяся со всех сторон, и даже не это было главным.
Having waited for the right moment, our hero pulled the trigger, and a powerful charge of holy energy flew straight into the vampire's head. A moment later, everyone saw a huge hole in the head of the already dead vampire. After it was finally over, Clifford felt a strong weakness wash over him, and he staggered a little. But unable to stay on his feet, he fell to the ground, and the holy knights standing nearby began to disperse.
Затем он закрыл рот обеими руками, стараясь не закричать. Повернув голову, он увидел перед собой труп одного из своих друзей.
Some were jumping up and down in joy, celebrating their victory, while others couldn't hold back their tears of joy, but Dan wasn't one of them. As he set out to find Clifford, he quickly came across Angelique, carrying two unconscious bodies. At the same time, a small detachment of people approached the walls of the fortress. But judging by the shouts coming from there, they realized that they were too late.
Через некоторое время Хаджун скорбно вздохнул, вытирая кровь ящеролюдей с лица.
He said with disappointment that since he was informed about the manifestation of abnormal activity in the land of the dead, he thought that the king of necromancers had been resurrected, but it turned out that it was the most ordinary vampire performing his tricks. He then added that, judging by the fact that this vampire was unable to cope with a bunch of ordinary prisoners and ordinary guards, consisting of local residents, one can conclude that these vampires are not that strong.
Парень начал произносить слова по слогам.
The atmosphere he felt from the moment of arrival here, traces of the struggle between sacred and magical forces, were simply of incredible proportions, hinting that the battle that took place here was by no means so simple. Thinking about this, the man tried to understand who in Lopen could possibly possess such a great sacred power capable of stopping the vampire.
В этот момент одно из копий чудовищ пронзило сердце Хадзюна, который стоял в растерянности.
To this, the gray-haired man replied that it would be good if this were really the case, because he was sure that over time vampires would begin to mix en masse with people, and it would be much easier if strong priests or priestesses helped to sort this out. When a man nearby said that God had divided himself into parts for fun in order to awaken the sacred power in people, which is why they are extremely difficult to find and not so easy to awaken. But Harris knew this better than anyone else, so he replied that he only meant that there was no one in the fortress who could handle it. Then he turned around and gave the order to the holy knights to send priests and alchemists here to take care of the injured inhabitants of the fortress. He was about to leave, but was stopped by a sudden question from one of the knights about whether he would like to meet with the seventh prince who was there. This bold and dangerous question caused the gray-haired man's face to distort into a grimace of disgust, mixed with anger. There was a distinct thunder in his voice that made the knight shudder in horror when he asked why he should meet with this scum.
Болото, покрытое трупами. Даже сильные люди могли бы блевать при виде такой сцены, но парень не обратил на это внимания. Думая, что он может продолжить, он протянул руку, активируя силу пожирания. Черная дымка окутала мертвые тела ящеролюдей.
But the very next day, Dan arrived to him with a report of what had happened, in which he said that the seventh prince had also hunted the vampire and played a key role in its destruction. These words of the knight greatly surprised the emperor, which was clearly evident from the astonished expression on his face.
Конгу вспомнил, что где-то он уже видел что-то подобное, и в тот раз это было похоже на то.
When he told of Clifford's participation in the battle, venomous, mocking whispers swept through the hall among the nobles gathered there.
Было жаль это слышать, потому что ему было интересно, можно ли извлечь характеристики из игрока. Конг-У без всякого сожаления взглянул на тело Хаджуна. Он подумал, что раз у демона можно отнять силу, то велика вероятность, что ее можно отнять и у игрока. Но это было не так уж важно.
At this moment, the emperor could not bear it any longer and squeezed the armrest of the throne with such force that it became covered with deep cracks. In a voice full of anger, he asked Dan, who stood before him in bewilderment, whether he really wanted death at his hand so much that he dared to speak such heresy before him. To prevent the worst outcome of today's meeting, a man in a white cassock standing nearby intervened, cleared his throat, and announced that their emperor was not in a good mood today. Afterwards, the archbishop turned his gaze to the knight and sternly said that everything he had told him simply could not have happened in reality, because everyone knew that the younger prince was too spoiled and weak, and that he had neither manners nor an ounce of common sense. The man's words made Dan realize how difficult it was to be on the prince's side, but if he hadn't seen it for himself, he wouldn't have believed it now. So he simply said that he was reporting what he saw. After a brief silence, the archbishop sighed and shared that he had recently received another report in which the residents of Lopen actively defended Clifford and even called him a priest. When he suggested to the emperor to check if it was related to the strange energy he felt there, the emperor asked him with displeasure if he thought it could really be the prince's power. But the man shook his head and said that he simply did not want the prince to steal someone else's glory. The emperor tapped his armrest thoughtfully, thinking it all over carefully. After a few long moments, he turned to the knight, saying that he did not fully believe in the truth of his words, but still, each of the heroes should receive recognition for their contribution to the defense of Lopen's fortress.
Решив для себя, что ему нужно еще немного подкачаться.
And Danu promised a small territory of the northwestern region. After a slight pause, the emperor decided to shorten the seventh prince's exile. Immediately after his recovery, he gave the order to bring Clifford back to the palace. Sometime later, immediately after the meeting with the emperor ended, Dan, who had changed his knightly armor into a regular shirt and pants, quietly knocked on the door in front of him and announced that he had already returned from his mission. Having received permission, he opened the door and walked inside. The knight approached the huge bed on which the first prince lay, wrapped in bandages, and carefully asked if he was feeling better. He replied with a bit of sarcasm that it was a funny joke for someone whose accidental death would mean nothing, then added that his vision and hearing had deteriorated significantly over the past time, of which apparently he did not have much left. Dan, pursing his lips, looked sadly at Prince Alan. On these rare visits, memories of the past stung him with renewed vigor. Alan saw this perfectly well, so he smiled sadly and told him to come closer and not make such a face. Dan obediently came closer, leaning slightly over the bed. At that moment, the prince grabbed the knight tightly by the shirt and pulled him even closer to himself. The candle he was holding fell from his hands in surprise, but Alan didn't care at all. He looked into Dan's eyes with a mad look and asked what he was even thinking when he defended the seventh prince, who had defiled their mother's honor, from the emperor. Irritated by what was happening behind his back, he was sure that Dan had betrayed him and decided to side with Clifford. Literally seething with rage, he warned the knight that by choosing his brother, he had taken the wrong path because his brother would never become emperor. Dan shouted the prince's name loudly, appealing to his reason. Afterwards, he told Alan that he had overexerted himself and was now bleeding again. He came to his senses and looked at Dan standing in front of him with a more conscious gaze. Smiling guiltily, he apologized for his words, knowing that his loyal knight was not that kind of person, then opened his hand, allowing him to move away. Dan looked down and said that the prince did not need to apologize, because all responsibility for what happened that day lay on his shoulders. He should have stood his ground and stayed. Alan turned away and replied that in that case they would all have died together, but that they managed to survive only thanks to a group of warriors who arrived in time. Although now he considered that he, suffering from a curse that made his skin bleed constantly, was no more useful than a dead person. Alan turned his gaze to Dan standing next to him when he asked if he hated the seventh prince. Closing his eyes, he replied that he really hated him because Clifford had disgraced them and was now recklessly living the life their precious mother had given him. Clenching his fists, Dan asked cautiously, what if things weren't as they seemed? He shared his belief that Clifford had hidden his true motives in order to avenge his mother's death. To do this, he behaved like a real scumbag in order to achieve exile, where he could calmly gain strength. Alan interrupted Dan by calling his name. Looking at him with a puzzled expression, he asked if everything was all right with his head and suggested that he get a good rest if he was so tired. The knight sighed in disappointment and replied that he needed to carry out the emperor's orders, so he would soon head back to Lopen. The prince nodded and said that since it was an order, there was nothing that could be done. As much as he liked it, Alan understood that his brother's exile could not last forever, and sooner or later he would return back. During the 3 weeks following the battle, the fortress of Lopen was gradually restored.
Поскольку он закончил охоту раньше, чем ожидалось, у него появилось много свободного времени. К тому же он хотел бы опробовать свои новые способности.
Now, all his thoughts were occupied with the question of reward. But even if no reward followed, Smith did not regret that he had voluntarily provided his help, because he would never leave Angelica alone in this place. Suddenly, he noticed a box with the belongings of the dead standing nearby. Looking at them, Smith thought that since these things belonged to those who died hundreds of years ago, now they no longer belonged to anyone. Without any remorse, he was quickly tempted by the idea of acquiring a couple of 3 trinkets that would become as good as new once they were wiped down. He sank down in front of the box and looked around for any extra eyes, and then he began to actively study the contents, looking for valuable things.
Но как он ни старался, из-за переплетенных ветвей деревьев ничего не было видно.
The emblem on the parchment looked majestic, so Smith decided to grab it too. Meanwhile, Clifford, who had finally come to his senses, was actively devouring dish after dish, admiring their wonderful tastes because he had not eaten for so long. While clearing away the empty plate, Angelica reminded him that due to his long coma, the doctor advised him to eat as much as possible to restore his strength. Cliff remembered this very well as the fact that his awakening itself could already be considered a miracle. After examining him, the doctor said with displeasure that the amount of holy power spent by our hero would have been enough to turn a person into a cripple. But Cliff was a little luckier. Thanks to the medicine and holy power, he recovered much faster.
Кун-У не совсем понимал, что там происходит, но это определенно было ненормально.
The doctor reacted too violently to the prince's words about how much easier it would be to become a dead man, and even ignored how Angelica began to unravel the bandages from Cliff's head on his orders.
Тем временем Тайсу громко закричал, спрашивая ребят, почему они нападают на членов своей собственной группы.
These words greatly surprised our heroes, so much so that Angelica was even distracted from her work. The doctor noticed their reaction and explained that he had been treating her too for these 3 weeks. Hearing his question about whether the prince had any connection with sacred power or magic, Cliff asked if there were any problems. The man shook his head and said that in normal cases people can be cut, have limbs amputated, or even killed. But Angelica's body was very different from normal. At that moment, he had the feeling that he had seen His Majesty the Emperor 50 years ago. He explained that after defeating the Necromancer king, the Emperor's body had suffered such massive damage from the sacred power that it had to be put back together piece by piece, and he himself was in a coma, during which his body developed beyond any human limits. Therefore, he believed that Angelica had similar superhuman strength to him. Remembering this, Clifford looked at the girl carefully. In the window hanging above her head, he read that Angelica really did have a superhuman body and high concentration and was ready to do anything to help her master. Looking at this, our prince sadly thought that it was people like her who should be heroes, and not someone like him. Sighing, he asked Angelica to bring him a book so that he could somehow while away the time. Although Clifford was glad to have Eamon's ability, the recoil effect was too great, and his body couldn't handle it. He needs to use holy power often, but it's hard to do because of the other mana, so he decided to start with theory. All the books Angelica brought were about the theory of magic, sacred power, and the teaching of resurrection. Cliff picked up one of the books and began to study it, noting with satisfaction that everything was described in detail in the book. However, at times the author's extremely strong faith in the goddess went beyond the bounds, which our hero did not like very much. Standing next to him, Angelica watched him with a gentle smile. A sudden knock on the door caught their attention, and Cliff looked up from his reading to tell his guest he could come in. A few moments later, Dan stood in front of him. The prince put the book aside and admitted that he was surprised by his quick return from the palace. The knight nodded and said that he was in a hurry because he had important news. At that moment, Clifford remembered that the last time they were at the old temple, he had handed him a lot of money as payment for capturing Morgana. So now a happy smile blossomed on his face as he wondered what kind of reward might await him this time. Having heard that the order had been given by the emperor himself, he had no doubt that a sea of gold was already provided for him. However, the knight's next words shattered all his dreams and plunged the prince into deep shock. His reward was not gold coins and expensive silks, but an order to return back to the palace. Having received no answer, the knight was shown back out the door. Clifford completely ignored Dan, who was trying to shout at him through the door. As the completely exhausted prince headed back to the bed, Angelica asked in surprise if he really didn't want to go back that much, and he asked back who in their right mind would want to go back to such a dangerous place. He still didn't know who exactly was behind Morgana's case, so he wasn't eager to go back. Cliff's words about the danger awaiting him there made Angelica sad. Noticing this, he told her not to worry about it and not to pay attention to that guy. But Dan did not give up his attempts to make our prince change his mind. It even got to the point that at each meal, Clifford would find a note slipped into his plate asking him to return to the castle. And every morning he was awakened by Dan's loud voice, asking him again and again to think everything through. When Angelica finally came out to him, the man asked hopefully about the prince's decision. But contrary to his expectations, she only conveyed her master's words that Danu should get lost somewhere far away from here before he was showered with holy salt. The knight hesitated slightly after her words and awkwardly asked Angelica if she was returning home now. She replied that she had stopped in a hut with her father outside the walls of the fortress, where she was now heading. When he offered to walk her home, the girl refused, saying that she was capable of protecting herself. Fighting back his awkwardness, he admitted that he simply wanted to know the reason why Clifford continued to refuse to return to the castle. Angelica was silent for a moment, thinking. But then she said that the prince considered the palace too dangerous a place. Dean was not surprised by what he heard, because he knew very well that the position of the seventh prince there was really not the best, which he told the girl. After his words, she only became convinced that someone really was planning to kill her master, and that relatives should not be excluded from the list of suspects. She involuntarily clenched her fists, regretfully thinking that she was not strong enough yet. Thus, Angelica, accompanied by the knight, reached the house where a joyful smith was already waiting for her. At the sight of the holy knight, he was very surprised that he was here. And Dan, in turn, recognized the familiar face of Smith and asked if he had also helped here, as in that case with Morgana. Smith hesitated a little at such an unexpected question, but replied that he could not do otherwise, because they had to help each other. Afterwards, he rubbed the back of his head and said that it was time for him to return to the house. But the knight's request that he tell him more about his contribution to this battle made him linger. Angelica sighed and, leaving the men alone, entered the house. However, as soon as she crossed the threshold, her eyes widened in surprise. Her surprised voice attracted the men's attention. Pointing to the papyrus in her hand, she asked Smith what the document was and where it came from. He, trembling with fear, replied that it was his good luck talisman which he had not taken out for a long time. But it took Dan a moment to recognize the parchment as a family document bearing the seal of the Hughes family. 50 years ago, it was a fairly strong and famous family, protecting the borders of the northern region of Lopen. But in a mortal battle with Aemon, this family was wiped off the face of the earth. That is why Dan was so surprised to see here a document from the most courageous and loyal family to the Emperor. Suddenly, an incredible thought occurred to him. Looking at Sam and Angelique, he guessed that the two might be descendants of the surviving members of the Hughes family. This could very well explain to him why they had such a terrifying amount of power and why they were staying by the seventh prince's side without revealing their true identities to others. Fully confident in his arguments, he nodded and said seriously that he respected their desire to keep the mission a secret from everyone. Afterwards, he promised to write Angelica a recommendation for the Holy Knights, which caused great bewilderment and shock in both of them. Smith leaned forward and asked with a degree of disbelief whether Angelica would really be able to get into the palace. The knight nodded and added that after that, obtaining the status of an aristocrat would not be a problem. The words about the upcoming opportunity to learn from the best of the best, the art of the Sacred Empire's sword, and to provide worthy assistance to the seventh prince made the girl's eyes light up with desire and hope. So, without any hesitation, she confidently stepped forward and replied that she agreed. But she warned that if she had to be away from Prince Clifford when becoming a holy knight, she would not do it, to which Dan sighed wearily. And then he replied that if her mission was to protect the prince, then he would work harder to protect him together with her. He was willing to do anything to escort the Hughes family and the seventh prince to the palace. Fully prepared to be ignored once again, Dan was shocked when Clifford said the next morning that he was ready to go to the palace. For a moment, the knight even thought that his hearing was failing him, but the prince's determined look said otherwise. Therefore, having quickly collected everything they needed, they set out on their journey. The knight was troubled by such a sudden change of decision, so he could not help but ask Cliff about it. But instead of answering, he irritably asked what Dan was unhappy with. Now that they were already halfway to the palace, the knight carefully reminded him of how he had been slamming doors in his face for the last couple of days, not wanting to go back. Clifford looked away and replied that he had his reasons for that. In fact, he was very interested in one book that described unusual ways of using sacred power. However, he was unable to obtain more such information, because the book ended on the very topic that interested him most, with a caption stating that there would be a continuation. He sighed and said that the royal library had all sorts of books, and perhaps he would find what he needed there. When the knight noted his desire to study magic in depth, Clifford replied with displeasure that, since he was only getting sideways glances in the palace, it would be better to lock himself in the library. Dan understood why he made such a decision, so he advised the prince to relax, since it had been quite a while since his last visit to the palace. A couple of hours later, they arrived at the gates of entry into the capital. Angelica and Cliff looked out the window and looked at the streets in surprise, involuntarily amazed by the huge number of people. Pleased with their reaction, Dan couldn't help but notice that the capital had changed a lot during Clifford's absence. Then he turned his gaze to the prince himself and asked if he liked this place. But when he said that it stunk here, Angelica and the knight were perplexed, not understanding at all what he was talking about. Covering his mouth and nose with a handkerchief, Clifford said he had only one question for him. And pointing to the street, he asked if there were any dead people in the capital of the Sacred Kingdom. Throwing open the carriage door, our hero jumped out into the street. He rushed in a direction known only to him, completely ignoring the passers-by who crossed his path. Angelica and Dan, who didn't understand anything, tried to catch up with him. Even though the street was quite busy, Cliff was absolutely certain that he had caught the scent of a vampire. It was for this reason that he followed that terrible stench. After running through several alleys, he froze in place, giving his companions the opportunity to catch up with him. But he didn't even pay attention to them, because all his attention was riveted to someone's severed head lying on a box, surrounded by camellia flowers. The faces of the girl and the knight who stopped nearby showed strong shock. Suddenly, the stranger's previously closed eyes slowly opened and bloody tears began to flow from them. The next moment, she let out a terrifyingly deafening scream. Angelica and Dan covered their ears with their hands because they couldn't stand it. And Clifford summoned his shovel from his inventory. After that, he approached the monster incredibly quickly and cut its head in half. Having come to her senses, Angelica asked with genuine bewilderment in her voice about what had just happened. But the prince, whose attention was focused on something else, ignored her question. On the ropes located between the narrow passage of two houses hung the body of a zombie, judging by which the head belonged. Looking more closely, he realized that all the insides had been removed, and only the skin remained from the zombie. He jumped in surprise when suddenly a hoarse voice came from around the corner behind him, telling the prince that they had been followed the whole time. Cliff turned around instantly at the sound of the voice. Confused, Dan looked at him with incomprehension when he said that it was a red-haired, middle-aged man. Clifford explained to him that the man he had just described had said something strange and run away. Dan looked around carefully and assumed that this was most likely the culprit of this incident. The prince agreed with him and said with disappointment that now it would be even more difficult for them to track him down, because this stench had spread everywhere. A very bad feeling arose in his soul when the Holy Knight shared his plans to report everything that had happened immediately upon arriving at the palace. A little later, Cliff learned from Dan that the capital was currently in a state of chaos, because such murders had been happening quite often lately. For this reason, real chaos reigned on the streets of the city and in the castle due to the arrival of the infamous prince. Now, having arrived at the palace, the knight tried with all his might to appeal to Clifford's prudence, so that he would behave carefully and not get involved in new scandals here, and also told him about the upcoming banquet tomorrow. Listening to his moralizing for the second, if not third time, the hero lost his temper and irritably said that he understood everything perfectly the first time. The knight sighed and turned his gaze to Angelica, who understood perfectly well what he was going to say, so she answered in advance that she would take care of the inspection of the castle. Clifford decided that his presence would no longer be required anywhere and announced that he would lock himself in the library until tomorrow. When Dan shouted another reminder after him not to get into trouble, our hero's face once again showed irritation. As he walked to the library, he reflected on what was happening in the capital. At first, Cliff thought he was mistaken, but now he was sure that he could still smell that foul odor. And this could only mean that the vampire somehow managed to get into the castle. So now it was quite difficult to determine the exact source of this smell. He decided that he would listen to Dan's words and sit as quietly as possible. He even had a very tempting idea about simply running away immediately after finding the book he needed. The prince had absolutely no desire to be drawn into all these problems. Thinking about the library made him stop. Cliff only now realizing that he had already walked through this corridor several times. He sighed sadly, reluctantly admitting to himself that he was lost, when he suddenly noticed a statue standing nearby. Wondering whose statue this was, the hero came closer. After studying the inscription on the statue, Cliff thoughtfully rubbed the back of his head. The name written there seemed vaguely familiar to him, but he couldn't figure out where it came from. The only thing that was obvious was that she had been dead for a long time. Suddenly, the silence was broken by someone's painful cry and complaint about a sore back. The prince peered out from behind the statue and saw a man in loose clothing and a straw hat digging among the flowers. If at first our hero took him for a gardener, then immediately after the stranger's words that he should cut everyone's necks and use them as decoration, he was sure that a murderer was now at hand. The man turned slightly, continuing to lament with displeasure that his subordinates had become too lazy, enriching themselves only through taxes from the common people. At that moment, he looked straight at Clifford, who was standing in front of him, and angrily shouted that since he was back, he should have come, and said hello. After this, he ordered him in a commanding tone to bring a shovel and earth that were lying near the statue. The stranger's words caused displeasure in the prince, and he said that he was not obliged to do this. However, at that moment, the words that the strange man had said earlier flashed through his mind. So purely out of concern for his neck, Cliff forced a smile onto his face and cheerfully replied that he would do everything. This determination did not last long. He did not expect that a couple of bags of earth would be so heavy that he would barely be able to move. All this time, Harris kept his attentive gaze on the prince, which made him feel extremely uncomfortable and more than once regretted not wearing the new clothes offered by Dan, by which he would definitely not be mistaken for a gardener. Having finally dragged the pile to the right place, he unclenched his hands with relief and lowered the bags onto the stone slab. Then he looked at the man, intending to clear up the confusion, but suddenly noticed his hands covered in dirt. Cliff took his handkerchief out of his pocket, and Harris handed it to him, saying that he should not continue to work alone and ask someone for help more often. Instead of a handkerchief, his interlocutor grabbed his wrist, not allowing him to escape. The prince's face showed genuine bewilderment at everything that was happening. He didn't have time to ask what all this meant. Reaching for his hat with his free hand, the man thoughtfully noted that the rumors really weren't lying about the strong changes in character after memory loss. These words made Clifford wary. The man took off his hat and asked the prince if he didn't recognize his own grandfather. Half an hour later, he stood at the entrance to the throne room, cursing all the gods of this world. When the massive door opened before him, he saw the emperor sitting in his rightful place, all this time just waiting for the appearance of his grandson. He looked at the seventh prince again, trying to find something he hadn't noticed in the garden. Clifford dreamed of going back in time and never going to that damned garden where he had the misfortune of meeting the emperor. Suddenly, Harris's steely voice cut through the oppressive silence that had fallen in the hall. He told about the rumors that had reached him about how the hero had taken an active part in the defense of Lopin's fortress. The prince emerged from his thoughts and nodded, confirming these words. Harris raised an eyebrow and asked curiously if it was true that Clifford was the one who killed that vampire. This time he was in no hurry to answer. He had a bad feeling. So the prince decided to think carefully about the whole situation. Rumors about that incident with the corpses could not pass by a man like the emperor, and the prince understood this perfectly well. Therefore, it was naive to think that the Holy Emperor did not know that there was a vampire behind all this. He considered it the height of stupidity. Cliff realized that he had not been brought back to the palace to be recognized and rewarded. The emperor planned to find someone who would be able to catch the vampire causing trouble, and nothing more. Knowing this, the prince could not allow himself to fall into this trap, especially in front of so many people. So he replied that it was indeed his doing, but he would not be able to catch him on his own again. Hearing his last words, the emperor was truly surprised, which was clearly visible on his face. Clifford continued to say that he was able to do something like this only thanks to the large number of people around him. The Viscount, the Holy Knight Dan, and the inhabitants of the fortress themselves, who fought bravely on the battlefield. In as innocent a voice as possible, he spoke about how they were able to win that day only thanks to their combined efforts. Our hero planned to push all the laurels onto others in order to prevent the most problematic outcome of events for himself. Harris had been listening attentively to his grandson's story all this time, his frowning eyes never leaving his face. If he had any suspicions, he couldn't voice them because they were nothing more than speculation. He sighed wearily and replied that he had heard him, so now Clifford could go and have a good rest after such a long journey. Our hero was surprised that his plan was successful. He did not expect everything to be so simple. Therefore, being a little confused, he wished the emperor a successful hunt for the vampire. The words he said made the man shudder noticeably, and shock and realization flashed in his eyes. Cliff did not linger there for long and silently left the throne room, leaving the emperor alone with the nobility. He was still very confused. He remembered well what a nasty and disobedient boy his grandson had been just 6 months ago. Now it seemed like a different person appeared before him, who accepted someone else's help with dignity and was even able to notice the existence of vampires in the capital. Harris could not fully believe that someone could change completely after losing their memory. He was also worried about someone else, Angelica and Smith, about whom Dan had already reported to him, telling him that these two were the survivors of the Hughes family. If the knight's words were indeed true, then the emperor believed that they would be able to succeed in hunting vampires quite easily. Besides, he was well aware that this ancient family had always been famous for its martial arts, but not for its sacred power. In the report he had received from the Viscount earlier, it was written that the seventh prince had saved the lives of soldiers who were on the verge of life and death with the help of his sacred power. There was also a story that after Clifford's prayers, the blessing of the goddess descended upon them. But that wasn't the most surprising thing, because according to the report, the prince killed the vampire with an ordinary decorative gun. Despite the fact that the man was wearing a mask, the Viscount was completely sure that it was their prince, which he shared with the emperor. Harris sighed once again and asked the opinion of the nobles gathered here. When one of the men separated from the crowd and confidently declared that it was all a lie, the emperor could not hide the surprise that flashed for a few moments. Meanwhile, the man continued, reminding everyone of the seventh prince's words that he had not been on the battlefield for long. Everyone else immediately picked it up. But there were those who thought completely differently. So literally in an instant, the throne room was filled with the hum of voices arguing with each other. Harris ran his hand over his forehead, combing his gray hair back, his disappointment in the nobility growing with each passing day. As an emperor, he couldn't help but worry about the succession of the throne, which he would soon have to give up to an heir. However, now he not only didn't have a suitable heir, he didn't even have a person who could help him in the current situation. At that moment, the image of a happily smiling Anna from a long-forgotten past surfaced in his mind. His heart had long been eaten away by regret and thoughts that if nothing had happened on that fateful day, he would have long ago chosen his youngest grandson as his heir. Harris was fully aware of his current situation, because he had become colder and more closed, thinking only about the safety of the kingdom, and did not care at all about his own grandchildren. Clifford's words before leaving flashed through his mind, causing the Emperor to think that perhaps this child still had a chance. He tried to imagine what would happen if his grandson still had enough strength to deal with the vampire. But the necessary thought kept eluding him because of the incredibly loud screams of the nobility. Unable to contain himself, Harris jumped up from his throne and angrily barked that everyone should shut up immediately if they didn't want to get punched in the face. Everyone in the throne room immediately fell silent, fearing that this threat would come true. Some of them even looked guiltily at the floor. Only one man dared to speak to the enraged Emperor, Count Peterson, who suggested investigating the matter further. Not noticing any disapproval from the Emperor, he continued by saying that in 2 months, the anniversary of Lady Anne's death would be, and it would be wonderful if the 7th prince remained in the palace until then. Since Clifford would be assisting in the search for the vampire, he believed that the prince should be given the opportunity to rest until the upcoming banquet. Harris studied the man in front of him for a few moments, considering his words. Afterwards, he nodded his head approvingly and replied that for now, there really was no point in them rushing. It was only towards evening that our hero finally managed to get to the library. He opened the massive door, wondering with displeasure why it was so difficult to get through. Hearing his name, the prince was distracted from his thoughts and looked up at the speaker. Cliff was unpleasantly surprised to see another visitor here because he thought that at such a time no one would come here. When the girl standing in front of him quickly apologized and said that she would leave the library immediately, the prince's face showed confusion. When he said that the stranger could stay, she froze and looked at him with surprise and apprehension in her eyes. Clifford immediately noticed that for some reason the girl was not comfortable around him. But he did not know the reason for this, because he was seeing her for the first time and had done absolutely nothing to her. As soon as he thought this, his eyes widened in surprise. A memory of that loud scandal, because of which he was expelled, surfaced in his mind. It was this girl who was the injured party in that situation. For a few moments there was a tense silence in the library. For now they both remembered the events of the previous days very well. Now Cliff understood why Alice was so uncomfortable with him. He was sure that now she was thinking that the pervert had deliberately come back for her. In addition, thanks to the system, he learned that Raphael was not only her grandfather, but also the author of the book, the continuation of which he came here for. The realization that the book was written by an archbishop came as quite a surprise to him. At the same time, many memories surfaced in his memory of how he wrote various curses on the walls addressed to the archbishop himself. Clifford sighed heavily, ruffled his hair, regretting that he had met the author of such a valuable book in this way, and now could not even ask him about anything. His mechanical action made Alice shudder. The prince noticed this and awkwardly apologized, explaining that he had not meant to scare her, but had simply lost his memory and did not remember most of the people in the palace. But it was obvious from the girl's face that she didn't believe it, and, nodding slightly, she shrank her whole body even more. Clifford understood everything and did not blame her for this at all. So he quickly moved to the shelves, deciding to simply take the necessary book and leave here. But, to his surprise, this book was not on the shelf. The prince looked at the spines of the neighboring books with surprise, hoping that she would be found somewhere among them. At that moment, he heard the quiet voice of Angelica, who assumed that he was looking for the archbishop's books. When Cliff turned to her, the girl said that she was going to read it herself, but she could give it to him. To his objection, she replied that everything was fine and handed him the book. Our hero was in no hurry to take the book, having read the title, judging by which it spoke of resurrection. Angelica noticed his funny look at the name and said that these were just notes from her grandfather's research, and there was nothing special there. Besides, she believed that it was impossible to resurrect someone. Surprised, Clifford couldn't help but ask why resurrection was impossible. Alice handed the book to the prince, and then she answered that no matter how strong the sacred powers give life, it is impossible to catch a soul that has already left the body, and only necromancy is capable of doing something like that. But because necromancy requires too much payment, he does it, was prohibited. Therefore, Alice concluded that even with the blessing of the goddess, it is impossible to bring someone back to life. Clifford's question about whether a person who possessed both holy power and magic could do this left Alice stunned. She hesitated a little and replied that such people were extremely rare, and that if these two opposing forces were used simultaneously, the body might not be able to withstand them and explode. All this time, Cliff was flipping through the pages of the book, studying the contents, when the girl fell silent. He shared his thoughts that resurrection was not so impossible. Surprised, Alice asked what he meant. He said that necromancers use mana and spells. For their dark deeds, they touch magic and life, which increases their power, then asked if there was a way to increase sacred powers. Alice replied that she could use magic tools or prayer, but when she began to think about what Cliff meant, he remembered where he was and who he was discussing these things with. He quickly pushed the girl out of the library, saying that he had already talked her into too much trouble and did not dare waste her time any longer. When she tried to object, the prince promised to clean up after himself and turn off the light. Immediately after this, he slammed the door in front of the confused girl. Alice looked at the locked door for a few more moments, with many questions for Clifford in her head that remained unanswered. In addition, she was worried about the changes in the seventh prince, and this concerned not only his behavior but also his aura. Suddenly, someone called out to her, and she emerged from her thoughts. Raphael, standing nearby, smiled tenderly and asked what Alice was doing here at such an hour. Hearing that she had been studying, the man praised his granddaughter for her diligence and warned her to be careful because the seventh prince had returned to the palace. The girl only smiled tensely, deciding not to tell about what had happened in the library. Afterwards, the archbishop handed her a black raven mask. He asked Alice not to overexert herself too much. She was chosen by the goddess and had incredible talent. But the work that lay before her carried no less responsibility. The girl took the mask and nodded, saying that she was perfectly aware of this. She assured her grandfather that he need not worry because she was strong enough. So a couple of minutes later, accompanied by two more masked men, they entered the room. There, lying on the bed, the first prince, wrapped in bandages, screamed and writhed in pain. When Raphael said it was time to begin, Alice nodded hesitantly and put on her mask. Then, together with two other priests, she began to read a prayer, and the holy power emanating from them completely filled the room after a few moments. As soon as it enveloped the prince's body, he began to scream even louder from the hellish pain piercing his body with hundreds of needles. Alice did not stop praying, although she already saw a fairly obvious outcome. Against the backdrop of Alan's cursed body, even her powers were useless, and at this rate, he really would have practically no time left. The girl did not want to give up so early and find a way out of this situation, no matter what it cost her. Suddenly, Clifford's words about resurrection being possible flashed through her mind. Now, even despite all her own convictions, she desperately wanted these words to be true. Our prince at this time was studying information about all the nobles and the ruling family. Most of the information was about the emperor, but there was absolutely nothing about his parents. When Dan heard this question, he looked at the guy in amazement and asked why he needed this, because without this, he should remember his parents perfectly well. Cliff sighed with displeasure and again explained that he did not fake his amnesia and really forgot everything. So he asked the knight to tell him at least a little about them. He nodded his head weakly and said briefly that when they were alive, they lived a wonderful and ordinary life. The prince obviously expected more, so he raised a questioning gaze and asked if that was all. Dan replied that he knew nothing more. It was quite obvious that he was deliberately not wanting to talk, and Clifford didn't like it very much. The man's averted gaze only confirmed his suspicions that things were not going so smoothly in the relationships between the members of this family. Dan decided to change the subject and asked the prince if he was ready for the upcoming banquet. He even glanced at his interlocutor and asked why he needed it at all. The man replied that if Cliff did something wrong at the banquet, he could be ridiculed, and added that even Angelica had already learned palace etiquette almost perfectly so as not to disgrace him. When asked, with a hint of disappointment, why one couldn't just enjoy the banquet, Dan replied that a party and a banquet were two completely different things. Hearing that the first prince would also be attending the banquet, Clifford instinctively shuddered, not even understanding the reason for this reaction. Frowning, he asked who it was. The holy knight came closer and pointed to one of the images on the paper, telling the prince that this was his older brother and the person he should be most afraid of now. When the pain subsided, Alan was also informed about the upcoming banquet. This news that a banquet would be held for his idiot younger brother caused a dull rage in him. The following evening, light music played in the main hall of the palace, not drowning out the voices of the guests gathered there. Because she was the daughter of an archbishop and possessed considerable sacred power, guests would often approach Alice, inquiring about her progress in her studies. Even though her grandfather asked her not to go to this banquet, she simply could not do so. She thought that since he himself would not be here due to the fact that this banquet was dedicated to Prince Clifford, at least one of the two of them was obliged to be here. Hearing her name, Alice turned around. A man approached her with a smile on his face, whom she recognized as Count Peterson, and he praised her appearance, comparing the girl to an avatar of a goddess who had descended to Earth. With his appearance in the hall, the rest of the nobility began to whisper about the spreading rumors that the Count had recently begun to gain popularity among the common people and, due to his lack of interest in power, he had made useless volunteer work his hobby. Alice could not help but hear these conversations, which she clearly did not like. As she took a step towards the crowd, trying to silence them, Walter intervened and stopped the girl from such a rash act. With an awkward smile on his face, he asked her to leave everything as it was, because in the end, the rumors weren't so much of a lie, then told her that after his wife's death, volunteering had become the meaning of his life, which apparently wasn't exactly aristocratic. After listening to him, the girl waved her hands, convincing the man that he, on the contrary, deserved respect. Suddenly, she felt a strange, unpleasant feeling sweep over her entire body. Alice had known Walter for a long time, who was an old friend of Anna's, and knew very well that he was a good person, and that he even now continued to support the first prince and was completely devoted to him. There was nothing stopping him from taking advantage of opportunities to try to gain power. But instead, he continued to stay by Alan's side and always worries about his condition. Feeling incredibly uncomfortable, Alice apologized and said that she still had other guests to greet too. Immediately after that, she turned away, heading to the other end of the room. However, her attention was soon drawn to the loud cries of Smith, actively supporting Viscount Lopin, who, being an ordinary lord from the backwoods, was invited to such a luxurious place for the first time, and therefore was much more excited than usual. This funny scene made Alice smile involuntarily. Deciding that it was better for her to stay with people who were comfortable for her, she boldly approached the couple, which caused great surprise among the men, as the Archbishop's granddaughter had paid attention to them. Walter, standing nearby, listened attentively to their conversation. At some point, the color of his eyes changed to an unnaturally bright scarlet shade, and the shadow of a sinister smile appeared on his lips. When the front door suddenly opened, a loud announcement was made about the arrival of the 7th Prince Alan and his entourage. Our hero looked around at everyone present with an attentive gaze. Not wanting to be on public display, he noticed the sofa standing against the wall and quickly moved there. Although you wouldn't know it by looking at him, our hero was very surprised, because he expected that no one would come to this banquet because he was a prince who had absolutely no right to the throne. However, there were a lot of people here, and everyone, both men and women, cast interested glances towards Angelica, who was standing next to him. Turning to her, Clifford asked with genuine bewilderment why she was attracting so much attention. When the girl asked what he meant, the prince explained that she looked much more aristocratic than he did. At that moment, he noticed a joyful count heading towards them. While the man was greeting Dan standing next to him, Cliff cast a suspicious glance at the stranger and asked who he was. Instead of Walter, the question was answered by a puzzled Dan, who noted with reproach in his voice that his behavior was not even close to that of a prince, and then explained that Count Peterson was standing before them now. He assured the knight that everything was fine, since it was not surprising that he was not remembered after so much time had passed, then extended his hand to Cliff and apologized for not being there in difficult times. Without changing his suspicious expression, the prince reluctantly extended his hand in response. He knew very well that this man had served his mother in the past and supported him along with the first prince. Suddenly, a familiar system window appeared in front of him. As soon as our hero glanced at the information displayed there, shock appeared on his face. The count in front of him was a vampire whose age was unknown. It was also stated that the man was currently in a state of thirst, and his abilities were listed as black magic and dismemberment of bodies. But the count, it would seem, did not notice anything strange that had happened for just a moment, and with the same smile on his lips, asked if he liked the food at today's banquet. Shocked that the vampire didn't even show it, having sensed his involuntarily released holy power, the prince belatedly replied that the food was wonderful. The man's smile widened even more, and he said with satisfaction that he was pleased to hear this, since Clifford had tried the royal cuisine a long time ago. Wondering since when this guy appeared in the castle, he looked out from behind Walter. He glanced around at the crowd of people in front of him, looking for someone, and a few moments later he succeeded. One after another, many information windows with messages began to appear before his eyes. After studying them, Cliff slowly stood up and said that he remembered one thing that had greatly upset him during his meal. Walter frowned and asked what it was, but instead of answering, the prince called out to a waiter passing by and asked him to give him a glass too. As soon as the drink was in his hand, he looked at the shocked count, saying that it would be a shame if they did not try alcohol for the entire evening. The next moment, the holy power filled the glass of champagne, changing its color. A satisfied grin appeared on Walter's face. Luring the vampire into his plan, Clifford offered him a drink too. He almost immediately replied that he would do so with pleasure and took the glass. Clifford couldn't wait for the moment when the Count would drink the contents of the glass. Since he put his holy power into this water, it has now also become holy. The prince was almost 100% sure that the strange man he had noticed in that alley was the Count. Now all he had to do was uncover his true identity and identify the killer that the Emperor was so desperately looking for. Without hesitation, Walter drained the contents of the glass, sip after sip. When there was no more drink left, he slowly removed the cool glass from his lips. Afterwards, he smiled awkwardly, saying that because he drank so quickly, he already felt drunk. The man apologized to the prince and admitted that he was very weak when it came to alcohol. To his remark that Walter did not look drunk at all, the Count replied that he was not that drunk. The sudden sound of breaking glass and screams attracted the attention of the rest of the nobility. Count Peterson fell to the floor in horror and, looking straight at the sharp ends of the broken bottle, asked the prince in bewilderment what he was doing. But our hero, consumed only by the desire to reveal the truth, ignored this question and without a drop of pity swung the sharp ends of the bottle at the Count, wounding his hand. However, the next moment something completely different from what our hero expected happened. The whole body of the frightened Count was pierced by a shudder of fear, and instead of healing the wound, he pressed his wounded hand to himself and began to beg the prince to stop. At this point, Dan blocked Clifford with his back and apologized to the man, saying that their prince had had a little too much to drink. Afterwards, he suggested that the Count go and treat the wound. He looked at the knight in confusion and agreed, saying that it would indeed be better that way. Without stopping for another moment, the man quickly left the room. As soon as this happened, Dan relaxed and turned to the prince, asking why he did this. A worried Angelica suggested that perhaps he felt that something was wrong with the Count. Clifford's words that this Walter was very likely also a vampire greatly shocked his companions. Quickly coming to his senses, Dan clenched his fist and firmly said that in that case they needed to catch him immediately. But the hero stopped him from this impulsive decision, saying that they had no evidence and first simply asked him to bring him a pen and a piece of paper. The knight was surprised and confused by this request, so he asked Cliff why he needed this. In response, he said that it should already be obvious. They would track down their enemy. Meanwhile, Walter was running as fast as he could towards his chambers. Once he found himself in a room shrouded in semi-darkness, he could not hold back any longer. That's why the next moment bright red blood gushed onto the floor. His human appearance was rapidly changing to that of a monster. The vampire was in a real rage. He was sure that the kid had understood his true nature, because no one in their right mind would have offered him holy water, saying that it was alcohol. Suddenly another attack rolled in, and streams of blood began to flow from his mouth again. He tried his best to hold back the attack, frantically thinking about how he urgently needed new blood and fresh meat. At that moment, there was a soft knock on the other side of the door, and then the voice of the maid was heard, saying that she had come to clean his room. For a moment, the Count stood still, deciding what to do, but he quickly made the right decision and, thanking fate, with a satisfied smile on his lips, allowed the girl to enter. Opening the door slightly, Olga stepped inside, apologizing for disturbing. However, as soon as she went a little deeper, she froze in place from shock at the sight of multiple bloodstains on the floor and the huge pool of blood in which the Count stood. A few minutes later, 2 more maids passed by as Walter emerged from his chambers. Noticing him, the girls greeted him warmly, causing the man to smile back. He suggested that because of today's banquet the girls had a lot of work. The maids laughed merrily, saying that the Count was the only one who worried about them. The man decided to take advantage of this opportunity to cover his tracks by telling the girls that the maid named Olga had worked so well that he was thinking of hiring her to work for his estate and asked them to convey this request to the Grandmaster.